Polar bear attacks family on cruise shore tour. January 19th, 2025. The Arctic wind howled across the barren landscape of eastern Greenland with a ferocity that seemed to penetrate every layer of clothing, every gap in protective gear, reaching deep into the bones of anyone foolish enough to venture into this primordial wilderness. January 19th, 2025. Dawned with temperatures hovering at -38 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that transforms exhaled breath into instant crystalline sculptures and makes the simple act of breathing feel like swallowing shards of glass. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, a monochromatic canvas of white broken only by the occasional jagged outcropping of ancient black rock, worn smooth by millennia of wind and ice. Stephen Michael Henderson stood at the bow of the expedition vessel Arctic Pioneer, his weathered hands gripping the metal railing despite the thick insulated gloves that covered them. At 45 years old, Stephen possessed the lean, wiry build of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades working construction in Minneapolis. His body hardened by countless hours of physical labor under the unforgiving Minnesota sun and the bitter cold of Midwestern winters. His face, deeply lined from years of squinting against welding sparks and concrete dust, bore the permanent tan of someone who worked outdoors regardless of weather conditions. His dark brown hair, now streaked with premature silver at the temples, was hidden beneath a thick wool cap that his wife Sarah had knitted for him the previous Christmas. Stephen's pale blue eyes, the same striking shade that his daughter Emma had inherited, scanned the approaching coastline with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that he couldn't quite articulate. This trip to Greenland represented something more than just a vacation for the Henderson family. It was a celebration, a marker of achievement after years of careful financial planning and sacrifice. Stephen had worked double shifts for nearly 3 years, taking on weekend construction projects and foregoing countless small luxuries, all to afford this once-in-a-lifetime expedition that would take his family to one of the most remote and dangerous places on Earth. Standing beside him, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm, was Sarah Elizabeth Henderson, 43 years old, a woman whose natural beauty had only deepened with age and the responsibilities of motherhood. Her auburn hair, streaked with threads of gold that caught the weak Arctic sunlight, was pulled back into a practical ponytail beneath her insulated hood. Sarah worked as a registered nurse at Abbott Northwestern Hospital in Minneapolis, a job that had taught her to remain calm under pressure and to assess situations with clinical precision. Her green eyes, warm and intelligent, reflected both excitement for the adventure ahead and the ever-present concern of a mother who was acutely aware of the potential dangers they were facing. Sarah had been the one to suggest this particular cruise after reading about it in a travel magazine during a particularly brutal Minnesota winter. The article had featured stunning photographs of ice caves, pristine glacial landscapes, and the possibility of encountering Arctic wildlife in their natural habitat. She had shown the article to Stephen over breakfast one morning, pointing out the detailed descriptions of guided shore excursions and the emphasis on safety protocols that the cruise line maintained. What had sealed the decision for both of them was the educational component of the trip, particularly the opportunities it would provide for their children to experience a part of the world that few people ever had the chance to see. Their daughter, Emma Grace Henderson, 19 years old and in her sophomore year at the University of Minnesota studying environmental science, stood a few feet away from her parents, her digital camera already busy capturing images of the approaching coastline. Emma possessed her father's lean build and his striking blue eyes, but had inherited her mother's auburn hair and her naturally inquisitive nature. She was an honor student who had chosen environmental science specifically because of her deep concern about climate change and its impact on Arctic ecosystems. This trip represented more than just a family vacation for Emma. It was an opportunity to witness firsthand the effects of global warming on polar ice formations and to document what she was seeing for a research project she was planning to present in her advanced ecology course. Emma's enthusiasm for the trip was infectious, but it was tempered by the scholarly approach she brought to everything she encountered. She had spent weeks before the departure reading everything she could find about Greenlandic geology, climate patterns, and wildlife behavior. Her backpack contained not just camera equipment, but also a detailed journal where she meticulously recorded observations about ice formations, weather conditions, and any wildlife they encountered. She had already filled nearly 30 pages with notes and sketches during their 4 days at sea. 14-year-old Michael David Henderson, the youngest member of the family, possessed the restless energy and boundless curiosity that seemed to define teenage boys everywhere. Unlike his sister's scholarly approach to the trip, Michael's excitement was pure and unfiltered. He was fascinated by the extreme nature of everything around them, the impossible cold, the endless expanse of ice, the powerful engines of the ship that somehow managed to push through the frozen landscape that surrounded them. Michael was in his freshman year of high school, where he excelled in mathematics and harbored dreams of becoming an engineer like his grandfather had been. Michael's dark brown hair, inherited from his father, was constantly escaping from beneath his insulated cap, and his hazel eyes, a genetic compromise between his father's blue and his mother's green, darted constantly from one side to another, trying to absorb every detail of this extraordinary experience. He had brought along a small digital video camera that he used to record everything he found interesting, which seemed to include virtually every aspect of their journey. His footage already included detailed documentation of the ship's operation, interviews with crew members, and his own running commentary about the experience of traveling through Arctic waters. The family was part of a carefully selected group of 36 passengers aboard the Arctic Pioneer, an ice-strengthened expedition vessel specifically designed for polar exploration. The ship measured 230 feet in length and featured a reinforced hull capable of navigating through ice fields that would crush conventional vessels. The passenger capacity was intentionally limited to ensure both safety and an intimate experience with the Arctic environment. Each passenger had undergone extensive briefings about Arctic safety protocols, proper clothing requirements, and the importance of following guide instructions at all times. The cruise had departed from Reykjavik, Iceland, 5 days earlier, with the first 3 days spent crossing the Denmark Strait and navigating through increasingly dense ice fields as they approached the Greenlandic coast. The passengers included adventure travelers from around the world, retired professors from Germany studying glacial formations, wildlife photographers from Japan documenting Arctic fauna, a group of Australian researchers investigating the effects of climate change on polar ecosystems, and several American families, like the Hendersons, who had saved for years to afford this extraordinary experience. Captain Erik Lindqvist, a 57-year-old Norwegian with over 30 years of Arctic navigation experience, had briefed the passengers extensively about the unique challenges and opportunities that awaited them along the Greenlandic coast. Captain Lindqvist was a bear of a man himself, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with massive shoulders built by decades of physical work in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. His weathered face told the story of countless expeditions through Arctic waters, and his ice-blue eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had navigated through every conceivable challenge that polar waters could present. During the previous evening's briefing, Captain Lindqvist had explained the specific conditions they would encounter during their shore excursion to the ice caves near Scoresby Sound, the largest fjord system in the world. He had detailed the geological formations they would explore, the safety protocols that would be followed, and the wildlife they might encounter. His presentation had included extensive information about polar bears, emphasizing that while encounters were possible, the experienced guides carried high-powered rifles and signal flares specifically designed to deter aggressive wildlife. The expedition leader was Dr. Amanda Richardson, a 41-year-old glaciologist from the University of Alaska who had spent the past 15 years conducting research in polar regions around the world. Dr. Richardson possessed the kind of quiet competence that inspired confidence in even the most nervous travelers. Her slight build belied her incredible physical endurance and her ability to navigate safely through terrain that would challenge much larger and stronger individuals. She had led over 200 Arctic expeditions without a single serious incident, a safety record that was legendary in the small community of polar expedition leaders. Dr. Richardson's assistant was Marcus Johansson, a 28-year-old Greenlandic guide whose family had lived in the region for countless generations. Marcus possessed an intimate knowledge of local conditions, wildlife behavior, and survival techniques that had been passed down through oral tradition for centuries. His dark eyes and weathered features reflected both his Inuit heritage and his deep connection to the Arctic landscape. Marcus spoke fluent English, Danish, and Greenlandic, and served as both a cultural interpreter and a practical guide who could read subtle changes in weather and ice conditions that might escape the notice of even experienced outsiders. The shore excursion was scheduled to begin at 9:30 in the morning, with passengers transported from the ship to the coastline aboard two rigid inflatable boats specifically designed for Arctic conditions. The boats were equipped with twin outboard motors, emergency communication equipment, and survival gear sufficient to sustain all passengers for several days if emergency conditions prevented immediate return to the ship. Each passenger was required to wear a specially designed survival suit that would provide protection against hypothermia for up to 6 hours if they accidentally fell into the frigid water. The ice caves that were their destination lay approximately 2 miles inland from the designated landing site, accessible via a well-established trail that had been used by generations of local hunters and researchers. The caves themselves were formed by the interaction of geothermal activity and glacial ice, creating spectacular chambers of blue and white ice that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Dr. Richardson had explained that the caves represented a unique geological formation that provided insights into both the geological history of Greenland and the ongoing effects of climate change on Arctic ice formations. As the Arctic pioneer approached the landing site, Stephen Henderson felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that he had experienced before every major adventure in his life. He thought about the chain of decisions and circumstances that had brought his family to this remote corner of the world, reflecting on the years of planning and sacrifice that had made this trip possible. He remembered the countless evenings spent researching expedition options, comparing costs, and discussing the potential risks and benefits with Sarah and the children. The decision to take this particular trip had not been made lightly. Both Stephen and Sarah were acutely aware that they were taking their children into one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, a place where a single mistake or unexpected event could have catastrophic consequences. They had discussed these risks extensively with Emma and Michael, ensuring that both children understood the importance of following safety protocols and staying close to the guides at all times. Both children had demonstrated maturity and responsibility that convinced their parents they were ready for this level of adventure. Sarah Henderson checked her watch and noted that the scheduled departure time for the shore excursion was still nearly an hour away. She used this time to review the safety checklist that Dr. Richardson had provided, ensuring that each member of her family had all the required equipment and that everyone understood the procedures they would follow once they reached shore. Her nursing background had taught her the importance of preparation and attention to detail, particularly in situations where emergency medical care might be hours or even days away. The required equipment list was extensive and had been carefully developed based on decades of Arctic expedition experience. Each passenger carried emergency shelter supplies, high-energy food rations, water purification tablets, emergency signaling devices, and first aid supplies. The expedition guides carried additional equipment, including satellite communication devices, emergency medical supplies, and weapons for protection against aggressive wildlife. Dr. Richardson had emphasized that while polar bear encounters were rare, the guides were trained and equipped to handle such situations if they arose. Emma Henderson continued photographing the approaching coastline, paying particular attention to the ice formations and the ways that light reflected off the glacial surfaces. She had already taken over 300 photographs during the voyage, documenting everything from the ship's daily operations to the subtle changes in ice color and texture as they moved farther north. Her environmental science background provided her with a framework for understanding what she was seeing, and she found herself constantly amazed by the complex interactions between climate, geology, and biology that shaped Arctic ecosystems. The landscape that surrounded them was both beautiful and terrifying in its absolute indifference to human presence. Emma understood that they were visitors in an environment that had existed largely unchanged for thousands of years, a place where human beings were not merely unwelcome, but completely irrelevant to the natural processes that governed everything from weather patterns to the behavior of wildlife. This understanding filled her with both excitement and a healthy respect for the power of the natural world. Michael Henderson bounced impatiently from one foot to the other, his teenage energy barely contained by the confines of the ship's deck. He had been awake since 5:30 in the morning, too excited to sleep despite the early hour, and the knowledge that they faced a long and potentially exhausting day ahead. His video camera was already filled with footage from the voyage, but he continued recording everything he could see, creating what he hoped would be a comprehensive documentary of their Arctic adventure. The weather conditions on January 19th were considered excellent for an Arctic shore excursion. The wind speed was relatively moderate at 15 to 20 miles per hour, visibility was unlimited under the clear Arctic sky, and the temperature, while brutally cold, was within the range that experienced guides considered safe for properly equipped visitors. Dr. Richardson had explained that weather conditions in the Arctic could change rapidly and without warning, which was why they carried emergency communication equipment that allowed constant contact with the ship and with rescue services based in Iceland. At 8:45 in the morning, Dr. Richardson began the final safety briefing for passengers preparing to join the shore excursion. 24 of the 36 passengers had chosen to participate in the ice cave exploration, while the remaining 12 opted to remain aboard the ship and participate in alternative activities, including lectures about Arctic ecology and opportunities to observe local wildlife from the heated comfort of the ship's observation deck. The safety briefing covered every aspect of the excursion in meticulous detail. Dr. Richardson explained the communication protocols that would be followed, the procedures for dealing with equipment failures or medical emergencies, and the specific wildlife safety measures that would be implemented throughout their time on shore. She emphasized that polar bears were active throughout the winter months, and that while encounters were uncommon, they were always a possibility that required constant vigilance and immediate response to guide instructions. Marcus Johansson provided additional information about local conditions and wildlife behavior patterns. He explained that the area around the ice caves was not considered prime polar bear habitat, but that bears could appear anywhere along the coast as they hunted for seals and other prey. He described the warning signs that might indicate bear presence and emphasized the importance of staying together as a group and maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings. The weapons carried by the expedition guides were the subject of considerable discussion during the briefing. Both Dr. Richardson and Marcus carried high-powered rifles specifically designed for stopping large predators, along with signal flares and noise-making devices that could be used to deter bears without requiring lethal force. Dr. Richardson emphasized that their protocols prioritized avoiding confrontations rather than winning them, and that their route and timing had been specifically chosen to minimize the likelihood of wildlife encounters. At 9:15, passengers began boarding the rigid inflatable boats that would transport them to shore. The boats were operated by experienced crew members who had navigated Arctic waters for decades, and each boat was equipped with emergency equipment including additional survival suits, emergency shelter materials, and satellite communication devices. The journey from ship to shore was expected to take approximately 20 minutes, depending on ice conditions and weather. Stephen Henderson helped his family into the first boat, ensuring that each person's survival suit was properly sealed and that all safety equipment was securely fastened. The survival suits were bulky and awkward, making normal movement difficult, but they provided essential protection against the life-threatening effects of Arctic water exposure. Sarah had practiced donning and removing her suit several times during the voyage, and she helped Emma and Michael with the final adjustments to ensure proper fit and function. The boat ride to shore was an adventure in itself, as the rigid inflatable navigated between floating ice formations and approached a coastline that seemed utterly hostile to human presence. The water was so cold that steam rose from any surface that made contact with it, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed more like an alien landscape than anywhere on Earth. Emma continued photographing throughout the journey, capturing images of ice formations and the gradual transition from the open water around the ship to the ice-strewn waters near the coastline. Marcus Johansson used the boat ride to provide additional information about the geological formations they would encounter during their exploration of the ice caves. He explained that the caves were formed by the interaction of geothermal springs and glacial ice, creating chambers that remained stable for decades or even centuries before shifting ice conditions caused them to collapse and reform in new configurations. The caves they would explore had been known to local hunters for generations and had been mapped and studied by researchers for over 20 years. The landing site was a narrow stretch of rocky beach that provided stable footing and protection from the wind that swept across the open ice fields. The beach was scattered with ice formations that had been pushed ashore by wind and current, creating a landscape that looked like the aftermath of some titanic struggle between elemental forces. Dr. Richardson explained that the ice formations were constantly changing as wind and current shifted them, which meant that the beach looked different every time expedition groups visited the area. Once all passengers were safely ashore, the expedition guides conducted a final equipment check and reviewed the route they would follow to reach the ice caves. The trail led inland through a landscape of wind-sculpted snow and ice, following natural formations that provided some protection from the constant Arctic wind. The total distance to the caves was approximately 2 miles, but Dr. Richardson estimated that the journey would take nearly 2 hours due to the difficult terrain and the need to proceed carefully to avoid accidents. The landscape through which they would travel was unlike anything most of the passengers had ever experienced. The snow was not the soft, powdery substance familiar from temperate climates, but rather a hard, wind-packed surface that crunched underfoot and reflected the weak Arctic sunlight with an intensity that required protective eyewear to avoid snow blindness. The terrain was broken by wind-carved formations that created natural shelters and obstacles, requiring careful navigation to avoid becoming separated from the group. Emma Henderson was struck by the absolute silence that surrounded them once they moved away from the sound of the boat engines and the lapping of waves against the shore. The silence was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching through the snow and the occasional whisper of wind across ice formations. She had read about the acoustic properties of Arctic environments, but experiencing the phenomenon firsthand was profoundly different from understanding it intellectually. The group began their trek inland at 10:20 in the morning, moving in single file along the established trail with Marcus Johansson leading and Dr. Richardson bringing up the rear to ensure that no one fell behind or became separated from the group. The pace was deliberately slow and steady, designed to prevent exhaustion and to allow for frequent rest stops where passengers could warm their extremities and consume high-energy snacks that would help maintain their body temperature. Michael Henderson found the trek more challenging than he had anticipated, despite his youthful energy and enthusiasm. The survival suit that protected him from the cold also restricted his movement and made the simple act of walking require significantly more effort than normal. Additionally, the high altitude and thin air of the Arctic environment meant that physical exertion quickly became exhausting. He was grateful for the frequent rest stops and began to understand why the expedition guides had emphasized the importance of maintaining a steady but moderate pace. As they progressed inland, the landscape gradually changed from the rocky beach to a more varied terrain that included both glacial ice formations and areas of exposed rock where wind had scoured away the accumulated snow. Dr. Richardson provided a running commentary about the geological processes that had shaped the landscape, explaining how the interaction of ice, wind, and temperature fluctuations created the complex terrain through which they were traveling. The ice formations they encountered along the trail were spectacular examples of natural sculpture carved by wind and temperature into shapes that seemed almost deliberate in their beauty. Some formations resembled abstract art pieces, while others looked like the ruins of ancient buildings or the fossil remains of prehistoric creatures. Emma spent considerable time photographing these formations, trying to capture not just their visual impact, but also their relationship to the broader landscape of which they were a part. After approximately an hour of hiking, the group stopped for their first extended rest break at a natural shelter formed by wind-carved ice formations. The shelter provided protection from the constant Arctic wind and allowed passengers to remove their outer gloves long enough to consume warm beverages from insulated thermoses and high-energy snacks designed specifically for cold weather activities. Dr. Richardson used this break to review their progress and to check on the condition of all group members. Sarah Henderson took advantage of the rest break to assess her family's condition and to address any developing problems before they became serious. Her nursing background made her particularly sensitive to signs of cold-related stress or exhaustion, and she was pleased to note that everyone seemed to be handling the conditions well. She made sure that each family member was consuming adequate fluids and calories to maintain their energy levels and body temperature. The second portion of their trek took them through a landscape that was even more dramatically sculpted by wind and ice. They passed through a series of natural corridors carved between massive ice formations, creating an otherworldly environment that seemed more like the interior of a cathedral than an outdoor landscape. The ice formations rose 20 and 30 feet above their heads, creating walls that filtered and reflected the Arctic sunlight into patterns of blue and white that seemed to shift and dance as they moved through the corridors. Marcus Johansson explained that these ice corridors were formed by the interaction of wind patterns and the natural flow of glacial ice down from the higher elevations inland. The corridors provided natural protection from the worst of the Arctic weather, but they also created acoustic effects that could be disorienting for visitors unfamiliar with the environment. Sounds echoed strangely in the confined spaces, and voices seemed to come from unexpected directions. At 11:45, the group emerged from the ice corridors and caught their first sight of the cave system that was their destination. The caves were located in a natural amphitheater formed by glacial action, with the main entrance visible as a dark opening in what appeared to be a solid wall of blue-white ice. The approach to the caves required descending a natural slope that had been worn smooth by countless previous visitors, requiring careful attention to footing to avoid slips that could result in injury. Dr. Richardson gathered the group at the top of the slope leading down to the cave entrance and provided detailed instructions about cave safety and exploration procedures. She explained that the caves maintained a constant temperature that was actually warmer than the outside air, but that the transition from extreme cold to relative warmth could cause condensation problems with camera equipment and eyewear. She also emphasized that the cave environment could be disorienting and that maintaining contact with the guides was essential for safety. The cave entrance was large enough to accommodate several people at once, but Dr. Richardson insisted that they enter in small groups to avoid overcrowding and to ensure that everyone could safely navigate the potentially slippery surfaces inside. The first group to enter included Dr. Richardson, Marcus Johansson, and 6 passengers, including a German geology professor and his wife, who were documenting ice cave formations for research purposes. Stephen Henderson watched the first group disappear into the cave opening and felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension that he couldn't quite explain. There was something about the dark entrance that seemed ominous, despite Dr. Richardson's reassurances about cave safety and the extensive experience of their guides. He reminded himself that thousands of visitors had safely explored these caves over the years, and that their guides were among the most experienced in the world. The Henderson family was part of the second group to enter the caves, along with 4 other passengers and Marcus Johansson, who had emerged from the initial reconnaissance to guide additional visitors into the cave system. Marcus carried a high-powered LED lantern that illuminated the cave interior with brilliant white light that revealed the spectacular ice formations that gave the caves their reputation as one of the most beautiful natural phenomena in the Arctic. The interior of the cave was indeed warmer than the outside air, with temperatures hovering around 10 degrees Fahrenheit compared to the -38 degrees they had experienced during their trek. The cave walls were formed of ancient glacial ice that had been compressed and shaped over centuries, creating surfaces that ranged from mirror-smooth to intricately textured with patterns that seemed almost organic in their complexity. Emma Henderson was immediately enchanted by the play of light and shadow created by Marcus's lantern as it illuminated different sections of the cave interior. The ice formations created natural prisms that broke the lantern light into spectrums of color, painting the cave walls with shifting patterns of blue, green, and silver that seemed to pulse and flow as they moved through the chambers. She began photographing immediately, trying to capture not just the visual impact of the formations, but also the sense of being inside what felt like a living sculpture. The main chamber of the cave system was approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling that rose to a height of nearly 15 feet at its highest point. The floor was relatively smooth, but required careful attention to footing due to the thin layer of ice that formed naturally in the cave environment. Marcus explained that the chamber had been formed by geothermal activity that had melted out the interior space while leaving the structural ice walls intact. Michael Henderson was fascinated by the acoustic properties of the cave interior, discovering that even whispered conversations seemed to resonate and echo in unexpected ways. He experimented with his video camera, recording both the visual spectacular of the ice formations and the strange acoustic effects that made their voices sound different than they did in the outside environment. He found that the cave seemed to amplify some sounds while completely absorbing others. The group spent approximately 30 minutes exploring the main chamber and 2 smaller connected chambers that led deeper into the ice formation. Marcus provided detailed explanations about the geological processes that had created the cave system and the ongoing changes that continued to shape its interior. He explained that the caves were not permanent features, but rather temporary formations that could be dramatically altered or even completely eliminated by changes in geothermal activity or glacial movement. Dr. Richardson emerged from the deeper chambers and announced that it was time for the second group to begin their exit from the cave system to make room for the third and final group of visitors. The cave was large enough to accommodate everyone at once, but the expedition protocol required rotating groups to ensure that everyone had adequate time to safely explore and photograph the formations without feeling rushed or crowded. As the Henderson family and the other members of the second group began moving toward the cave entrance, Emma lingered for a few additional photographs of a particularly spectacular ice formation that seemed to glow with an internal light. She was fascinated by the way that the ancient ice had been shaped by natural forces into something that seemed almost architectural in its complexity and beauty. It was precisely 12:27 in the afternoon when Marcus Johansson suddenly stopped moving and held up his hand in a gesture that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the group. His expression had changed from the relaxed confidence he had displayed throughout their exploration to something much more serious and alert. He tilted his head slightly as if listening for something that the rest of the group could not hear. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the occasional drip of water from the cave ceiling. Emma Henderson found herself holding her breath, straining to hear whatever had caught Marcus's attention. The acoustic properties of the cave made it difficult to determine the direction or nature of any external sounds, and she felt a growing sense of unease that she couldn't explain. Marcus slowly reached for the radio clipped to his belt and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Richardson, this is Marcus. Are you reading me?" The radio crackled with static for a moment before Dr. Richardson's voice responded, equally quiet. "I'm here, Marcus. What's your status?" "I'm hearing something outside the cave that doesn't sound right," Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving the cave entrance. "It could be wind, but it's got a pattern that's making me nervous. How many people do you have in your group right now?" Dr. Richardson's response came after a pause that seemed longer than it probably was. "I have 8 people with me in the third chamber. Everyone accounted for. What kind of pattern are you hearing?" Stephen Henderson felt his heart rate increase as he listened to the radio exchange between their guides. His construction experience had taught him to pay attention to subtle warnings and changes in routine that might indicate developing problems. The fact that Marcus, who had seemed completely confident and relaxed throughout their expedition, was now showing signs of concern was enough to put Stephen on high alert. Marcus motioned for the group to remain absolutely quiet and slowly moved toward the cave entrance, staying close to the ice wall and avoiding the center of the opening where he would be visible from outside. He reached into his pack and withdrew a pair of high-powered binoculars, then carefully positioned himself where he could observe the area outside the cave while remaining concealed within the shadows of the entrance. The sounds that had attracted Marcus's attention became audible to the rest of the group as they stood in complete silence. It was a rhythmic sound that could have been wind moving through ice formations, but there was something about the cadence and intensity that suggested movement rather than weather. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions, as if something large was moving in a circular pattern around the cave entrance. Sarah Henderson instinctively moved closer to her children, her nursing training automatically shifting her into emergency assessment mode. She began mentally reviewing the emergency procedures that Dr. Richardson had outlined during their safety briefings, trying to remember the specific protocols for wildlife encounters and evacuation procedures. She also began assessing the cave environment as a potential shelter, considering factors such as ventilation, temperature, and available space for an extended stay if necessary. Marcus lowered his binoculars and slowly backed away from the cave entrance, his expression grim. He keyed his radio again and spoke in the same quiet voice. "Doctor Richardson, I need you to get your group as far back into the cave system as possible right now. We have a polar bear outside, and it's not just passing through. It's investigating the area around the cave entrance." The words polar bear seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, transforming the cave from a place of wonder and beauty into a potential trap. Emma Henderson felt her camera suddenly become weightless in her hands as the reality of their situation began to sink in. She had read extensively about polar bear behavior and knew that they were apex predators with no natural fear of humans, and the physical capability to kill a person with a single swipe of their massive paws. Michael Henderson's first reaction was to reach for his video camera, but his father's hand immediately stopped him. Stephen's expression was deadly serious as he whispered, "No cameras, no sounds, nothing that might attract its attention." The teenage part of Michael wanted to argue, but the tone in his father's voice made it clear that this was not a discussion. Dr. Richardson's voice came through the radio with instructions delivered in the calm, professional tone that had reassured passengers throughout the expedition. "Marcus, I'm moving my group to the back of the third chamber. Can you get your group back here without going past the entrance?" Marcus studied the cave layout and shook his head, even though Dr. Richardson couldn't see the gesture. "Negative. The only way to the third chamber is past the main entrance. We're going to have to stay put and hope it moves on." The polar bear that was investigating the cave entrance was a mature male, approximately 8 feet tall when standing on his hind legs and weighing close to 800 pounds. His thick white fur was stained with blood from a recent seal kill, and his black nose was actively testing the air currents that carried the scent of humans from inside the cave. Polar bears possess one of the most acute senses of smell in the animal kingdom, capable of detecting prey from distances of up to 20 miles when conditions are favorable. This particular bear had been hunting along the coastline for 3 days without a successful kill when the scent of humans reached him. Unlike the seals and other marine mammals that formed his normal prey, humans represented something unfamiliar and potentially threatening. However, hunger and curiosity were stronger than caution, and the bear had begun investigating the source of the unusual scents. The bear's behavior pattern was typical for a polar bear encountering something unknown. He circled the cave entrance at a distance of approximately 50 yards, testing the air from different directions and gradually moving closer as his confidence increased. His massive paws left deep prints in the wind-packed snow, and his movement was virtually silent despite his enormous size. Marcus Johansson had encountered polar bears on numerous occasions during his years as an Arctic guide, but this situation was particularly dangerous because they were trapped in a confined space with limited options for escape or evasion. The cave provided protection from the bear's initial approach, but if the animal decided to investigate the interior, their options would become extremely limited. The bear's investigation of the cave entrance continued for nearly 15 minutes, during which time the two groups of visitors remained absolutely motionless and silent. The acoustic properties of the cave meant that even the smallest sound could potentially be amplified and carried to the bear outside, alerting it to their exact location and numbers. Sarah Henderson found herself conducting a mental inventory of the emergency medical supplies available to their group and calculating treatment options for various types of injuries that might result from a polar bear encounter. Her nursing experience had taught her that preparation and planning could mean the difference between life and death in emergency situations. And she forced herself to remain clinically focused despite the fear that was growing in her chest. The bear's behavior began to change at approximately 12:45, shifting from cautious investigation to more aggressive exploration. The sounds from outside the cave became more frequent and closer to the entrance, suggesting that the animal was gaining confidence and becoming more interested in whatever was inside the cave. Marcus made the decision to attempt communication with the bear using a technique that had sometimes been effective in previous encounters. He slowly reached into his pack and withdrew a small air horn designed to produce a loud noise that might startle the bear and encourage it to move away from the cave entrance. However, he also knew that the technique could backfire and provoke the bear into a more aggressive response. The first blast from the air horn echoed through the cave like a gunshot and was immediately followed by an ominous silence from outside. Marcus waited 30 seconds before activating the horn again, this time with 2 short blasts designed to mimic distress calls that bears often associated with injured or dying prey animals. The response from outside was immediate and terrifying. Instead of retreating, the bear responded to the air horn with a roar that seemed to shake the ice walls of the cave. The sound was unlike anything any of the visitors had ever heard, a deep, rumbling bellow that spoke of enormous size and barely contained aggression. Emma Henderson felt her legs become weak as the reality of their situation fully hit her. She had studied polar bear behavior extensively and knew that males during the winter hunting season were among the most dangerous predators on Earth. A bear that was actively investigating their location and responding aggressively to deterrent attempts was exhibiting behavior that suggested it was considering them as potential prey rather than a threat to be avoided. The bear's next action confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Instead of moving away from the cave entrance, the animal began approaching directly, its massive paws crunching through the snow with a rhythm that suggested deliberate, purposeful movement. Marcus immediately reached for his rifle, a high-powered weapon specifically designed for stopping large predators at close range. "Dr. Richardson," Marcus whispered into his radio, "the bear is not responding to deterrent attempts. It's approaching the cave entrance directly. I'm going to have to consider lethal response options." Dr. Richardson's voice came back immediately. "Understood, Marcus. Do what you need to do to protect the group. We're prepared to support you from back here if necessary." Stephen Henderson felt every instinct in his body screaming at him to grab his family and run, but his rational mind understood that there was nowhere to go. The cave entrance represented the only exit from their current location, and the bear was positioned directly between them and any possibility of escape. He moved closer to Sarah and the children, positioning himself between them and the cave entrance while trying to prepare mentally for whatever was about to happen. The bear appeared at the cave entrance at exactly 12:51 in the afternoon, its massive head silhouetted against the bright Arctic sunlight behind it. The animal was even larger than Marcus had estimated, with a head that seemed impossibly broad and powerful. Its small black eyes reflected an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly focused as it studied the interior of the cave. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the bear remained motionless at the entrance, its massive frame blocking most of the light from outside and creating a shadow that seemed to reach deep into the cave interior. Marcus held his rifle in a ready position but did not yet raise it to his shoulder, hoping against hope that the bear might lose interest and move away. The bear's investigation of the cave interior began slowly and deliberately. It extended its massive head into the entrance and tested the air, its sensitive nose gathering information about the number, size, and condition of the humans inside. The animal's breathing was audible throughout the cave, a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to resonate through the ice walls. Michael Henderson found himself holding his breath without realizing it, afraid that even the sound of breathing might trigger an attack. His teenage mind was racing through possibilities and escape scenarios. But every option he could imagine seemed to end with the same terrifying conclusion. The bear took its first step into the cave at 12:53, its massive paw landing on the ice floor with surprising gentleness. The animal was being cautious, testing the unfamiliar environment while maintaining its focus on the humans it could detect deeper in the chamber. Marcus raised his rifle to his shoulder and sighted down the barrel at the bear's head, knowing that if he was forced to shoot, he would have time for only one well-placed shot before the animal could cover the distance between them. His years of experience had taught him that wounded polar bears were exponentially more dangerous than healthy ones, which meant that any shot he took would have to be immediately fatal. The bear continued its advance into the cave, moving with the fluid grace that seemed impossible for an animal of its size. Each step brought it closer to the group of humans who were pressed against the back wall of the main chamber, desperately hoping that the animal might lose interest and retreat. Sarah Henderson found herself praying for the first time in years, bargaining with whatever deity might be listening to protect her children from the nightmare that was unfolding in front of them. Her rational medical training told her exactly what kind of injuries resulted from polar bear attacks, but she forced those thoughts aside and focused on the possibility that they might somehow survive this encounter. The bear was now approximately 20 feet from their group when it stopped and rose up on its hind legs, standing to its full height of nearly 8 feet and displaying the massive size and power that made polar bears the apex predators of the Arctic. From this position, the animal had a clear view of every person in the chamber and could easily identify the smallest and most vulnerable members of the group. Emma Henderson found herself staring directly into the bear's small black eyes and feeling a sense of communication that was both fascinating and terrifying. The animal's gaze seemed to assess her individually, measuring her size and threat potential with an intelligence that was unsettlingly human-like. Marcus's finger tightened on the rifle trigger as the bear lowered itself back to all fours and began moving again. The animal was now close enough that Marcus could see individual details of its massive head and could smell the strong, musky odor that all polar bears carried. He knew that he was rapidly approaching the point where waiting any longer would eliminate his opportunity for an effective shot. The bear's attack came without warning at exactly 12:55 in the afternoon. One moment, the animal was moving slowly and deliberately toward the group, and the next it was charging at full speed with a roar that seemed to fill the entire cave with sound. The transformation from cautious investigation to aggressive attack happened so quickly that even Marcus, with all his experience, was caught slightly off guard. Marcus's rifle fired just as the bear reached the halfway point of its charge, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the cave like thunder. The heavy bullet struck the bear in the shoulder rather than the head, spinning the animal slightly but failing to stop its forward momentum. The bear's roar of pain and rage was even louder than its initial charge, and its attack became even more focused and determined. Stephen Henderson reacted instinctively, pushing Sarah and the children toward the deepest corner of the chamber, while putting himself between his family and the charging bear. His construction background had given him quick reflexes and the ability to react decisively in dangerous situations, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the speed and power of an attacking polar bear. Marcus was working the bolt of his rifle to chamber another round when the bear reached him, its massive paw striking him across the chest and launching him backward into the ice wall with force that would have killed a smaller man. The rifle flew from his hands and skittered across the ice floor, coming to rest near the cave entrance where it was useless to anyone else in the group. The bear, wounded and enraged, turned its attention to the rest of the group with the single-minded focus of a predator that has committed to an attack. Its shoulder was bleeding heavily from Marcus's shot, but the wound had only served to increase its aggression rather than slow it down. Emma Henderson found herself separated from the rest of her family when the bear's charge scattered the group across the chamber. She was pressed against the ice wall near the cave entrance, close enough to Marcus's fallen rifle that she could see it clearly, but too far away to reach it safely. Sarah Henderson grabbed Michael and pulled him behind a natural ice formation that provided minimal cover, but at least blocked them from the bear's direct line of sight. Her nursing training had taught her triage principles that applied even in this situation. Protect the most vulnerable first and deal with other priorities as opportunities arose. The bear's next target was Stephen Henderson, who was still trying to position himself between the animal and his family. Stephen had no weapons and no experience with dangerous wildlife, but his determination to protect his wife and children gave him courage that surprised even himself. The bear struck Stephen with its right paw in a blow that sent him sprawling across the ice floor, his heavy winter clothing providing some protection but not enough to prevent serious injury. Stephen felt ribs crack under the impact and tasted blood in his mouth, but adrenaline kept him conscious and focused on getting back to his feet. Michael Henderson, despite his mother's attempts to keep him hidden, broke from cover and ran toward his father. His teenage mind had not fully processed the reality of the situation, and his instinct to help his injured father overrode all considerations of personal safety. The bear's attention immediately shifted to Michael, the smallest and most vulnerable member of the group. The animal's predatory instincts focused on what it perceived as the weakest prey, and it began moving toward the 14-year-old with the same deliberate purpose it had shown throughout the attack. Sarah Henderson screamed her son's name and broke from her own cover, following him toward the center of the chamber where Stephen was struggling to regain his feet. Her maternal instincts completely overrode her survival training, and she found herself running directly toward the most dangerous predator on Earth in an attempt to protect her child. Emma Henderson, seeing her entire family in the open and in immediate danger, made a decision that probably saved their lives. Instead of trying to reach the rifle, which was still too far away, she grabbed a piece of ice debris from the cave floor and hurled it at the bear's head while screaming at the top of her lungs. The ice struck the bear in the face, surprising rather than injuring it, but succeeding in diverting its attention from Michael back to Emma. The animal's small eyes fixed on her with predatory focus, and it began moving in her direction with the fluid grace that made its attack so devastatingly effective. Marcus Johansson, despite his injuries from being thrown against the cave wall, was struggling to regain consciousness and reach his backup weapon, a large-caliber handgun that he carried for exactly this type of emergency. His chest felt like it was on fire, and he was having trouble breathing, but he could hear the sounds of the ongoing attack and knew that every second counted. Dr. Richardson's voice came through the radio, tinny and distorted by the acoustics of the cave. "Marcus, what's your status?" We heard gunshots and shouting. No one was in a position to answer her call. Marcus was too injured to reach his radio, and the Henderson family was completely focused on surviving the next few seconds of the polar bear's attack. The bear reached Emma just as she was trying to scramble toward another piece of cover. Its massive paw struck her in the back, sending her tumbling across the ice floor toward the cave entrance. The blow was powerful enough to knock the wind from her lungs and send her camera flying into the cave wall, where it shattered into pieces. Stephen Henderson, despite his own injuries, managed to get back on his feet and position himself between the bear and Emma. He had no weapon and no plan beyond the desperate hope that he might be able to distract the animal long enough for his daughter to escape or for help to arrive. The bear's attack on Stephen was swift and brutal. The animal rose up on its hind legs and brought both front paws down on Stephen's chest and shoulders, driving him to the ground with force that could be heard throughout the cave. Stephen's winter clothing provided some protection, but the bear's claws penetrated the insulation and fabric, creating deep lacerations across his chest and arms. Sarah Henderson reached her husband just as the bear was preparing for another attack. Without thinking about the consequences, she grabbed a larger piece of ice debris and struck the bear across the face with all the strength she could muster. The blow succeeded in getting the animal's attention, but also made her its next target. The bear's paw struck Sarah in the side, spinning her around and sending her crashing into Michael, who had been trying to help his father. Both mother and son went down together, Sarah's body partially shielding Michael from the impact, but also trapping him beneath her weight. Marcus Johansson finally managed to reach his handgun, and despite his injuries and the chaos surrounding him, fired 3 shots at the bear from a distance of less than 10 feet. 2 of the shots missed, striking the ice walls and sending sharp fragments flying throughout the chamber. The 3rd shot struck the bear in the hindquarters, adding to its injuries, but again failing to stop its attack. The wounded bear, now hit by 2 firearms and increasingly enraged by pain and frustration, turned its attention back to Marcus as the source of the gunfire. The animal charged across the chamber with speed that seemed impossible for something so badly injured, reaching Marcus before he could fire again. Emma Henderson, despite her own injuries from the bear's earlier attack, managed to reach Marcus's dropped rifle. The weapon was far heavier than anything she had ever handled, and she had no experience with firearms beyond basic safety instruction, but desperation gave her strength and focus that surprised her. The rifle was still loaded with 1 round in the chamber, and Emma managed to work the bolt action to chamber the cartridge. She had no time to aim properly, but the bear was large enough and close enough that precision was less important than speed. Emma's shot struck the bear in the side of the head, just behind the left ear. The heavy bullet penetrated the animal's skull and caused immediate catastrophic damage to its brain, dropping the 800-pound predator instantly. The bear collapsed less than 3 feet from Marcus, its massive body coming to rest in a position that blocked the cave entrance. The sudden silence that followed the final gunshot was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it. The only sounds in the cave were the labored breathing of the injured humans and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The entire attack had lasted less than 4 minutes, but it had seemed like hours to everyone involved. Dr. Richardson's voice came through the radio again, more urgent this time. "Marcus, we heard more gunshots. What is your situation? Do you need medical assistance?" Emma Henderson, who was closest to Marcus's radio, managed to reach the device and key the microphone. Her voice was shaky but clear as she reported, "Doctor Richardson, this is Emma Henderson. The bear is dead, but we have multiple injuries. We need medical help immediately." The response was immediate. "Emma, this is Dr. Richardson. I'm coming to you right now with medical supplies. How many people are injured, and what is the nature of their injuries?" Emma looked around the cave chamber and tried to assess the condition of each family member. Her father was lying motionless near the cave wall, his winter clothing torn and bloody. Her mother was conscious, but appeared to have significant injuries to her side and was having trouble breathing. Michael was trapped beneath their mother, but seemed to be moving and conscious. "My father is seriously injured and unconscious," Emma reported. "My mother is conscious, but has trouble breathing and appears to have injuries to her ribs or side. My brother seems okay, but is trapped. Marcus is conscious but has chest injuries and trouble breathing." Dr. Richardson acknowledged the report and began making her way through the cave system toward the main chamber, carrying a comprehensive medical kit that included supplies for treating traumatic injuries. She also used her satellite communication device to contact the Arctic Pioneer and request immediate medical evacuation for multiple serious injuries. The medical assessment that Dr. Richardson conducted when she reached the main chamber confirmed Emma's initial evaluation, but revealed additional injuries that were not immediately apparent. Stephen Henderson had suffered 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe lacerations to his chest and arms, and a concussion from striking the ice wall. His condition was critical and required immediate emergency treatment to prevent life-threatening complications. Sarah Henderson had suffered 2 broken ribs and severe bruising to her left side, but her injuries were less immediately life-threatening than her husband's. Michael Henderson had escaped serious physical injury, but was showing signs of shock and psychological trauma that required careful monitoring. Marcus Johansson had suffered a severe chest contusion and possible internal injuries from being thrown against the cave wall. His breathing was labored, and he was showing signs of internal bleeding that could become life-threatening without proper medical treatment. Dr. Richardson immediately began emergency treatment procedures, focusing first on Stephen Henderson's punctured lung, which was the most immediately life-threatening condition. She used a needle thoracostomy procedure to relieve the pressure that was building in his chest cavity, a technique that probably saved his life, but required evacuation to a proper medical facility as soon as possible. The emergency response that followed the bear attack involved coordination between multiple agencies and represented one of the most complex Arctic rescue operations conducted in recent years. The Arctic Pioneer immediately began emergency procedures to prepare for medical evacuation, including clearing the ship's small medical facility for emergency surgery and contacting Coast Guard rescue services based in Iceland. The initial evacuation from the cave to the coastline required improvising stretchers from emergency equipment and carefully transporting the injured through the same difficult terrain that had taken them 2 hours to traverse on the way in. The return journey, carrying injured people through Arctic conditions, took nearly 4 hours and required the combined efforts of all available expedition staff and several passengers who had medical or emergency response experience. The ship's medical facility was equipped to handle minor injuries and routine medical problems, but was not designed for the level of trauma care that the bear attack victims required. The ship's doctor, Dr. James MacLeod, a 62-year-old Scottish physician with extensive experience in remote medicine, worked with Dr. Richardson to stabilize the patients for the journey to proper medical facilities. Stephen Henderson's condition remained critical throughout the evacuation process. His punctured lung was successfully treated with the initial emergency procedure, but his other injuries required surgical intervention that was beyond the capabilities of the ship's medical facility. Dr. MacLeod administered pain medication and IV fluids while monitoring his vital signs and preparing for possible emergency surgery if his condition deteriorated during transport. The decision was made to alter the ship's course and head directly for Nuuk, Greenland, the largest city on the island and home to the most advanced medical facilities within reasonable distance. The journey to Nuuk would take approximately 18 hours at the ship's maximum speed, during which time the medical team would have to maintain the patient's condition without the benefit of modern hospital equipment. Sarah Henderson's injuries were stabilized more easily, but she required ongoing monitoring for possible internal bleeding and complications from her broken ribs. Dr. MacLeod was particularly concerned about the possibility of lung puncture or damage to internal organs that might not be immediately apparent. Michael Henderson's physical injuries were minor, but his psychological trauma was severe enough to require sedation and constant supervision. The teenager had witnessed his entire family being attacked by one of nature's most powerful predators, and the emotional impact of the experience was causing symptoms that included hyperventilation, uncontrollable shaking, and periods of dissociation. Marcus Johansson's condition was complicated by the possibility of internal bleeding and damage to his chest cavity that could not be properly diagnosed without imaging equipment. Dr. MacLeod treated him for possible pneumothorax and monitored his vital signs while preparing for emergency intervention if his condition worsened. Emma Henderson had suffered the least serious physical injuries, but she was also dealing with the psychological trauma of having killed the polar bear that attacked her family. The 19-year-old environmental science student found herself struggling with complex emotions about taking the life of an animal that she had studied and admired, even though she understood that her actions had been necessary to save human lives. The journey to Nuuk was complicated by weather conditions that worsened significantly during the night, with wind speeds increasing to over 40 miles per hour and visibility dropping to near zero due to blowing snow. Captain Lindqvist and his crew had to navigate through increasingly dangerous ice conditions while maintaining maximum speed to ensure that the injured passengers reached medical care as quickly as possible. The ship's passengers, who had signed up for an adventure cruise but had not expected to witness a life-threatening emergency, responded to the crisis with remarkable calm and cooperation. Several passengers with medical training volunteered to assist with patient care, while others helped with the additional duties required to maintain ship operations during the emergency transit. The communication systems aboard the Arctic Pioneer were used to maintain constant contact with medical facilities in Nuuk and with family members of the injured passengers. The ship's communication officer worked throughout the night to coordinate with emergency services and to provide updates to the families who were anxiously waiting for news. Stephen Henderson's wife, Margaret, his sister living in Minneapolis, received the first notification of the bear attack at approximately 3 in the morning local time through a call from the cruise line's emergency contact service. The news that her son-in-law was critically injured in a polar bear attack in Greenland was so unexpected and surreal that she initially thought it was some kind of mistake or prank call. The reality of the situation became clear when she received a follow-up call from Dr. MacLeod aboard the Arctic Pioneer, who provided a medical briefing about Stephen's condition and the treatment that was being provided. Dr. MacLeod explained that while Stephen's injuries were serious, the emergency treatment had been successful and his condition was stable for transport to proper medical facilities. Margaret Henderson immediately began making arrangements to travel to Greenland to be with her family, a process that proved surprisingly complicated due to the remote location and limited transportation options. Commercial flights to Nuuk were infrequent, and the weather conditions that were affecting the Arctic Pioneer were also impacting air travel throughout the region. The story of the polar bear attack began reaching international media outlets within hours of the ship's initial emergency broadcasts. The dramatic nature of the incident, combined with the remote location and the involvement of a family with children, created a news story that captured global attention. News organizations struggled with the limited information available and the difficulty of reaching the remote location where the attack had occurred. Initial reports were often inaccurate, with some outlets reporting that all family members had been killed and others suggesting that the attack had occurred aboard the ship rather than during a shore excursion. The first accurate reporting about the incident came from Arctic news services that specialized in covering events in polar regions and had established relationships with expedition cruise companies. These organizations were able to provide factual information about the attack and the ongoing rescue efforts, while other news outlets were still struggling to verify basic details. The conservation implications of the polar bear attack became a subject of immediate debate among wildlife experts and environmental organizations. Polar bears are protected species throughout their range, and the killing of a bear in self-defense raised questions about expedition protocols and the impact of tourism on Arctic wildlife. Dr. Margaret Stonehouse, a polar bear specialist at the University of Alberta, who had studied Arctic wildlife for over 20 years, provided expert commentary about the incident for several news organizations. She explained that polar bear attacks on humans were extremely rare, but were becoming more frequent as climate change altered the bear's habitat and hunting patterns. Dr. Stonehouse emphasized that the bear involved in the attack was likely a hungry male that had been unsuccessful in hunting seals and had been attracted to the cave area by the scent of humans. She noted that the guides had followed proper protocols and that the killing of the bear was clearly justified as necessary to protect human lives. The environmental organization Polar Bears International issued a statement about the incident that expressed sympathy for the injured family while also calling for increased research into the effects of climate change on polar bear behavior. The organization noted that shrinking sea ice was forcing polar bears to spend more time on land and potentially increasing the likelihood of human-bear encounters. The Arctic Pioneer reached Nuuk at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon on January 20th, nearly 26 hours after the bear attack had occurred. The ship was met at the harbour by emergency medical teams and ambulances that had been positioned to provide immediate transport to Nuuk Hospital, the most advanced medical facility in Greenland. Stephen Henderson was the first patient to be evacuated from the ship, transported by ambulance to the hospital's emergency department, where a surgical team was standing by to provide definitive treatment for his injuries. The hospital had been in communication with the ship's medical team throughout the journey and had prepared for the specific types of injuries that the bear attack had caused. The surgical repair of Stephen Henderson's injuries required a 6-hour operation that addressed his punctured lung, repaired the lacerations to his chest and arms, and treated internal injuries that had not been apparent during the initial assessment. The surgical team included specialists who had been flown in from Denmark specifically to provide care for the bear attack victims. Sarah Henderson underwent less extensive surgery to repair her broken ribs and to address internal bruising that had caused ongoing pain and breathing difficulty. Her operation was successful, but she required several days of hospitalization for monitoring and recovery. Michael Henderson was treated primarily for psychological trauma, with counseling services provided by specialists who had experience dealing with wildlife attack survivors. The teenager's physical injuries were minor, but the emotional impact of the attack required ongoing treatment that would continue for months after the family returned home. Marcus Johansson underwent emergency surgery to repair internal injuries that had been caused when the bear threw him against the cave wall. His injuries included a damaged spleen and internal bleeding that had gone undetected during the initial treatment. The surgery was successful, but his recovery required an extended hospital stay. Emma Henderson received treatment for her physical injuries, which included bruising and lacerations from the bear's attack, but her most significant challenge was dealing with the psychological aftermath of killing the polar bear. Counseling services were provided to help her process the complex emotions surrounding her actions during the attack. The investigation into the polar bear attack was conducted jointly by Greenlandic wildlife authorities and expedition cruise industry safety experts. The investigation sought to determine whether proper protocols had been followed and whether any changes in safety procedures were needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The investigation concluded that all proper safety protocols had been followed and that the guides had responded appropriately to an extremely dangerous situation. The report noted that polar bear attacks were inherently unpredictable and that even the most experienced guides and comprehensive safety procedures could not eliminate all risks associated with expedition travel in polar regions. The final report recommended several minor changes to expedition protocols, including enhanced wildlife detection equipment and additional training for guides in emergency medical procedures. However, the investigation found that the overall safety procedures used by the expedition were appropriate and that the attack represented an unavoidable encounter with unpredictable wildlife. The polar bear involved in the attack was examined by wildlife biologists who were trying to understand what had motivated its aggressive behavior. The examination revealed that the bear was an adult male in poor physical condition, likely due to unsuccessful hunting during the winter season. The bear showed signs of starvation that may have made it more likely to view humans as potential prey. The examination also revealed that the bear had been injured in a previous encounter, possibly with another bear or during a hunting accident. These existing injuries may have affected its behavior and made it more aggressive than would normally be expected from a polar bear encountering humans. The conservation implications of the bear's death were addressed through a detailed report to international wildlife authorities and contribution to research funds that support polar bear conservation efforts. The incident was classified as a justified killing in defense of human life, but the loss of the animal was still considered significant given the threatened status of polar bear populations. Stephen Henderson's recovery required 3 additional surgeries and a 6-week hospital stay in Denmark, where he was transferred for specialized care that was not available in Greenland. His injuries healed successfully, but he was left with permanent scarring and ongoing issues with reduced lung capacity that affected his ability to perform the physically demanding construction work that had been his livelihood. The Henderson family faced significant financial challenges due to the medical expenses associated with their injuries and the extended time away from work during recovery. Insurance coverage was complicated by the remote location of the incident and questions about coverage for adventure travel activities. The cruise line provided some assistance, but the family ultimately faced substantial out-of-pocket expenses. The psychological recovery process proved to be more challenging and longer-lasting than the physical healing for all family members. Each person dealt with post-traumatic stress symptoms that included nightmares, anxiety about outdoor activities, and difficulty with enclosed spaces that reminded them of the cave where the attack occurred. Emma Henderson's psychological recovery was complicated by her role in killing the polar bear. While she understood intellectually that her actions had been necessary to save lives, she struggled emotionally with having taken the life of an animal that she had studied and admired. Counseling helped her work through these complex feelings, but the experience fundamentally changed her relationship with wildlife and her career goals in environmental science. Michael Henderson's recovery included ongoing therapy to address the trauma of witnessing his family being attacked and the helplessness he felt during the incident. His academic performance suffered initially, but with support from counselors and teachers, he was eventually able to resume normal activities and complete his education. Sarah Henderson's nursing background helped her understand the medical aspects of everyone's recovery, but it also made her acutely aware of how much worse the outcome could have been. Her return to work was delayed by both her physical injuries and the psychological impact of the experience. The family's relationship with outdoor activities and adventure travel was permanently changed by the attack. While they eventually resumed some recreational activities, they never again participated in expedition travel to remote locations. The experience had taught them that even the most carefully planned adventures carried risks that could have life-changing consequences. The legal proceedings following the polar bear attack were relatively straightforward, due to the clear evidence that the killing had been necessary to protect human lives. However, the family did pursue legal action against the cruise line regarding safety protocols and emergency response procedures. The lawsuit alleged that the cruise line had not adequately informed passengers about the risks associated with shore excursions and had not provided sufficient safety equipment and training for the guides. The case was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that helped cover the family's medical expenses and ongoing treatment costs. The polar bear attack had lasting impacts on expedition cruise industry safety protocols. New requirements were implemented for wildlife detection equipment, guide training, and emergency response procedures. The incident became a case study used in guide training programs throughout the polar expedition industry. The story of the Henderson family's polar bear attack became the subject of documentaries, books, and academic studies about wildlife encounters and adventure travel safety. While the family initially cooperated with media coverage, they eventually became more selective about their participation as they focused on their recovery and return to normal life. 5 years after the attack, the Henderson family had largely recovered from their physical injuries, though Stephen continued to deal with reduced lung capacity and Emma had changed her career focus from field research to environmental education. The psychological scars remained, but had become manageable through ongoing counseling and support. The incident remained a sobering reminder of the unpredictable nature of wildlife and the inherent risks associated with adventure travel in remote locations. It highlighted both the importance of safety protocols and the reality that some risks cannot be completely eliminated when humans venture into the territories of apex predators. The conservation lessons learned from the attack contributed to ongoing research into polar bear behavior and the effects of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. The incident provided valuable data about bear behavior under stress and the circumstances that can lead to aggressive encounters with humans. The cave where the attack occurred was temporarily closed to tourist visits, while wildlife authorities conducted additional research and implemented enhanced safety measures. When visits eventually resumed, new protocols included additional guides, improved communication equipment, and more comprehensive wildlife monitoring systems. The polar bear population in the region continued to face challenges related to climate change and habitat loss, making each individual bear loss significant for conservation efforts. The incident highlighted the need for balance between providing educational opportunities for the public and protecting both wildlife and human safety. The Henderson family's story became part of the broader narrative about human-wildlife conflict in an era of climate change and increasing adventure tourism. Their experience illustrated both the wonder and the danger of encountering wildlife in its natural habitat, and the importance of respecting the power and unpredictability of apex predators. The attack also raised questions about the ethics of adventure tourism in sensitive ecosystems and the responsibility of tour operators to protect both their clients and the wildlife they encounter. These discussions contributed to industry-wide improvements in safety protocols and environmental impact assessments. 10 years after the attack, polar bear encounters with humans had become more frequent as climate change continued to alter Arctic ecosystems and reduce the sea ice that bears depend on for hunting. The Henderson family's experience had become an important reference point for understanding how to respond to such encounters and how to balance tourism opportunities with safety considerations. The family members had all found ways to integrate their experience into their ongoing lives. Stephen had transitioned to less physically demanding work, but remained active in outdoor recreation closer to home. Sarah continued her nursing career with additional expertise in trauma recovery. Emma had become an environmental educator who used her experience to teach others about wildlife conservation and safety. Michael had pursued engineering as planned and had developed an interest in designing safety equipment for adventure travel. The story of their survival had become more than just an account of a wildlife attack. It had become a testament to family bonds, human resilience, and the complex relationship between humans and the natural world. Their experience continued to inform safety protocols, conservation efforts, and the ongoing debate about adventure tourism in vulnerable ecosystems. The polar bear that died in the cave had become part of ongoing research into Arctic wildlife behavior and conservation. Tissue samples from the bear had contributed to genetic studies of polar bear populations and research into the health impacts of environmental changes on Arctic wildlife. The cave itself had been modified with new safety features including emergency communication equipment, emergency shelter supplies, and enhanced lighting systems. These improvements allowed tours to resume while providing additional safety margins for future visitors. The Henderson family's story remained a powerful reminder of both the beauty and the danger of the Arctic environment, and of the importance of respecting the wildlife that calls these remote places home. Their survival had required courage, quick thinking, and the willingness to take difficult actions under extreme pressure. Their experience had also demonstrated the importance of emergency preparedness, skilled guides, and coordinated rescue efforts in ensuring that wilderness adventures don't become tragedies. The improvements in safety protocols that resulted from their attack had likely prevented similar incidents and saved other lives. As climate change continued to alter Arctic ecosystems, the lessons learned from the Henderson family's encounter with a polar bear remained relevant for understanding how humans and wildlife might coexist in a changing world. Their story had become part of the larger narrative about conservation, adventure travel, and the unpredictable intersection of human activities and wildlife behavior in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The legacy of their survival continued to influence how people thought about adventure travel, wildlife encounters, and the responsibilities that come with venturing into the territories of apex predators. Their experience had shown that even the most careful planning and preparation could not eliminate all risks, but that proper protocols and quick thinking could mean the difference between tragedy and survival. January 19, 2025, had begun as an adventure for the Henderson family and had become a life-changing encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators. Their survival had required everything they had to give, and their recovery had taught them about resilience, family bonds, and the complex relationship between humans and the natural world. Their story remained a powerful reminder of both the wonder and the danger that await those who venture into the world's most remote and beautiful places. The next stories: Polar Bear Devours Ice Fisherman, January 8, 2025. The wind howled across Hudson Bay with the fury of winter's final assault, carrying with it the scent of death that would soon permeate the frozen landscape near Churchill, Manitoba. On the morning of January 8, 2025, the temperature registered -37 degrees Celsius, with wind chills plummeting to -52, creating conditions so severe that exposed skin would freeze in under 2 minutes. The ice stretched endlessly in all directions, a white canvas of desolation that had claimed countless lives throughout the centuries, but none quite like Harold Benjamin Peters would experience on this day that would forever alter the lives of everyone who witnessed what transpired on the frozen waters of Hudson Bay. Harold Peters, 59 years old, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 215 pounds, his weathered face bearing the deep lines of a man who had spent 4 decades working the oil rigs of northern Alberta before retiring to his modest cabin on the outskirts of Churchill 3 years earlier. His thick brown beard, streaked with premature grey from years of harsh prairie winters, provided little protection against the biting wind as he loaded his ice fishing equipment into the back of his red Ford F-150 pickup truck at 4:30 in the morning. The truck, a 2019 model with over 120,000 kilometers on the odometer, had been his faithful companion through countless fishing expeditions across the Northern Territories, its reinforced chassis and winter tires making it one of the few vehicles capable of navigating the treacherous ice roads that led to his favorite fishing spots along the bay. The pre-dawn darkness enveloped Churchill like a suffocating blanket, broken only by the occasional flicker of aurora borealis, dancing across the star-filled sky. Harold had chosen this particular morning for his weekly ice fishing expedition based on weather reports, indicating a temporary lull in the blizzard conditions that had plagued the region for the past 10 days. The local meteorological station, operated by Environment and Climate Change Canada, had issued a cautionary advisory warning of unstable ice conditions due to recent temperature fluctuations. But Harold, like many veteran ice fishermen in the region, believed his decades of experience trumped any government warning about conditions he had navigated safely hundreds of times before. His wife of 34 years, Margaret Louise Peters, 56, had awakened at 4 o'clock to prepare his thermos of black coffee and pack his lunch of ham sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs, and homemade chocolate chip cookies, the same routine she had followed every Wednesday for the past 3 years since Harold's retirement from Syncrude Canada Limited. Margaret, a petite woman standing 5 feet 4 inches with greying auburn hair and worried green eyes, had expressed her concerns about the severe weather conditions, but Harold had dismissed her fears with the same confidence that had carried him through countless dangerous situations during his oil rig career. She watched from the kitchen window as her husband loaded his equipment, the familiar weight of anxiety settling in her chest like a stone, though she could never have imagined that this would be the last time she would see him alive. Harold's ice fishing setup consisted of professional-grade equipment accumulated over years of serious pursuit of northern pike, lake trout, and the occasional Arctic char that ventured close to shore during the winter months. His Eskimo Fatfish 949i portable ice shelter, weighing 42 pounds when packed, could accommodate up to 3 people and featured an insulated floor system designed to maintain interior temperatures 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside conditions. The shelter's wind-resistant fabric, rated for winds up to 60 miles per hour, would prove inadequate against the forces that would soon descend upon the frozen lake. His power auger, a StrikeMaster laser hand auger with a 10-inch diameter cutting head, could drill through ice up to 4 feet thick in under 30 seconds. Though the ice where Harold planned to fish measured approximately 18 inches thick, according to his depth measurements from the previous week. The drive from Harold's cabin on Kelsey Boulevard to his chosen fishing spot on Hudson Bay required navigating 12 kilometers of increasingly treacherous terrain, beginning with the maintained municipal roads of Churchill before transitioning to unofficial ice roads carved by decades of local traffic across the frozen landscape. The route took Harold past the Churchill Northern Studies Centre, a research facility studying climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems, where Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Thornfield, 38, a marine biologist from the University of Manitoba, was conducting her 3rd winter of polar bear behavioural research. Dr. Thornfield, originally from Winnipeg, had earned her doctorate studying the feeding patterns of polar bears during extended ice-free periods, and had documented increasingly desperate hunting behaviours among the local bear population due to climate change, reducing their traditional seal hunting opportunities. At 5:15 in the morning, Dr. Thornfield was reviewing overnight footage from remote cameras positioned throughout the Churchill Wildlife Management Area, when she noticed unusual movement patterns from a large male polar bear designated as Bear MB47 in her research database. The bear, estimated to weigh between 600 and 700 pounds and measuring approximately 8 feet in length, had been tracked for the past 18 months using a satellite collar fitted during a previous research capture operation. MB47's tracking data showed the animal had not successfully hunted a seal in over 3 weeks, an unprecedented duration that indicated severe nutritional stress and increasingly desperate hunting behavior. The bear's movement patterns throughout the night had taken him progressively closer to known human activity areas, including the ice fishing locations frequented by local residents. Harold arrived at his fishing destination at 5:45 in the morning, parking his truck approximately 50 meters from the shore on what he believed to be solid ice based on his previous visits to the location. The spot, located roughly 8 kilometers northeast of Churchill proper, was known locally as Peters Point, named not for Harold, but for his late father-in-law, Robert Peters, who had discovered the location's exceptional fishing potential in the 1970s during his career as a Hudson Bay Company fur trader. The area featured a natural depression in the lake bottom that attracted schools of fish during the winter months, making it one of the most productive ice fishing locations within reasonable driving distance of town. Harold had successfully fished this location over 100 times during the past 3 years without incident, building a false sense of security that would prove fatal on this particular morning. The process of setting up his ice fishing operation required approximately 45 minutes of intensive labor in the brutal cold. Harold first established his shelter location by using his GPS unit to mark coordinates that had proven successful during previous expeditions, then began the arduous process of drilling fishing holes through the 18-inch thick ice using his power auger. The mechanical sound of the auger cutting through the frozen surface echoed across the empty landscape, a sound that would later prove to have attracted unwanted attention from MB-47. Who was hunting approximately 2 kilometers away when Harold began his setup process. Polar bears possess extraordinarily acute hearing, capable of detecting sounds from distances exceeding 5 kilometers, and the unfamiliar mechanical noise represented a potential food source worth investigating for an increasingly desperate predator. As Harold worked to establish his fishing setup, the sun began its slow winter rise over Hudson Bay, casting long purple and orange shadows across the snow-covered ice. The temperature had risen slightly to minus 34 degrees Celsius, though the wind chill factor maintained life-threatening conditions for any exposed skin. Harold wore multiple layers of specialized cold-weather gear, including a base layer of merino wool long underwear, insulated coveralls rated for minus 40 degrees, a down-filled parka manufactured by Canada Goose specifically for Arctic conditions, insulated boots rated for minus 60 degrees, and a fur-lined hat that had belonged to his father. Despite this extensive protection, the extreme conditions required constant vigilance to prevent frostbite on exposed areas of his face and hands during the setup process. By 6:30 in the morning, Harold had successfully drilled 4 fishing holes in a diamond pattern approximately 10 feet apart and had deployed his portable fish finder to identify the most promising locations for setting up his tip-up fishing rigs. The electronic fish finder, a Vexilar FLX30 with GPS mapping capabilities, showed encouraging signs of fish activity at depths ranging from 22 to 28 feet below the ice surface. Harold set up 3 tip-up rigs baited with live minnows purchased from Gus's bait and tackle shop on Churchill's main street the previous evening, while reserving the 4th hole for active jigging using his ice fishing rod equipped with a selection of spoons and jigs designed to attract northern pike and lake trout. The first 2 hours of fishing passed peacefully, with Harold successfully catching and releasing 2 small northern pike weighing approximately 4 and 6 pounds respectively. The fish showed typical winter lethargy, but provided encouragement that larger specimens might be present in the area. Harold maintained radio contact with his fishing partner Thomas William Mackenzie, 62, a retired Canadian National Railway conductor who lived on Burney Street in Churchill. Thomas had planned to join Harold for the fishing expedition, but had awakened with symptoms of influenza and decided to remain home, on the advice of his wife, Eleanor Mackenzie, a retired registered nurse who worked 28 years at the Churchill Health Centre before retiring in 2019. Thomas Mackenzie had been Harold's closest friend since Harold's arrival in Churchill, bonding over their shared love of ice fishing and their similar backgrounds as retired industrial workers adapting to life in Canada's north. Thomas stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed 190 pounds, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Hudson Bay's fishing locations accumulated during 40 years of residence in Churchill. His decision to remain home due to illness would spare him from witnessing the horrific events that would unfold, though he would later struggle with survivor's guilt, believing that his presence might have altered the outcome of Harold's encounter with MB-47. At 8:15 in the morning, Harold radioed Thomas using his handheld Motorola two-way radio to report his fishing success and describe the improving weather conditions. The wind had decreased significantly since dawn, dropping from sustained speeds of 40 kilometers per hour to approximately 25 kilometers per hour, making the extreme cold more bearable and creating optimistic conditions for an extended fishing session. Harold's voice carried enthusiasm as he described the fish activity and his plans to remain at the location until mid-afternoon before returning home. This radio communication would be the last time anyone would hear Harold's voice under normal circumstances. Unknown to Harold, MB-47 had been methodically approaching his location for the past hour and 30 minutes, following the unfamiliar sounds and scents emanating from the human fishing operation. Polar bears possess olfactory capabilities approximately 7 times more sensitive than bloodhounds, capable of detecting seals beneath 3 feet of snow from distances exceeding 20 kilometers. The sense of Harold's baitfish, combined with human odors and the mechanical smells of his equipment, created an irresistible attraction for the desperately hungry predator. Dr. Thornfield's research had documented increasingly bold behavior from polar bears during periods of extended fasting, including approaches to human settlements and aggressive investigation of any potential food sources. The bear's approach demonstrated the calculating intelligence that makes polar bears among the most dangerous predators on Earth. Rather than approaching directly across the open ice, where Harold might have spotted the movement, MB-47 utilized natural terrain features, including snowdrifts and pressure ridges, to conceal his advance. Polar bears are capable of moving virtually silently across ice and snow, despite their massive size, using their enormous paws as natural snowshoes while maintaining perfect balance even on unstable surfaces. The bear's approach took him through an area where the ice had heaved and buckled during the fall freeze-up, creating a landscape of ice walls and crevasses that provided perfect concealment for a stalking predator. At approximately 9:20 in the morning, Harold detected his first indication of the bear's presence when one of his tip-up flags activated, indicating a fish had taken the bait. As Harold approached the activated tip-up rig, he noticed unusual tracks in the snow approximately 30 meters from his fishing holes. The tracks measured 18 inches in length and 12 inches in width, with clearly visible claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the pad impressions. Harold's experience in northern Alberta had familiarized him with black bear and grizzly bear tracks, but these impressions were significantly larger and showed the distinctive characteristics of polar bear paws, including the partially webbed toes adapted for swimming and the massive claws designed for gripping ice and tearing through seal-breathing holes. The sight of the bear tracks triggered an immediate adrenaline response in Harold's system, flooding his bloodstream with stress hormones that heightened his awareness while simultaneously impairing his decision-making capabilities. Harold's rational mind recognized the extreme danger represented by polar bear tracks in his immediate vicinity, but his emotional attachment to his expensive fishing equipment and his confidence in his ability to handle dangerous situations led him to make the fatal decision to continue fishing rather than immediately abandoning his setup and retreating to his truck. This decision, made in a moment of calculation that weighed potential loss of equipment against perceived risk, would seal his fate within the next 15 minutes. Harold attempted to radio Thomas to report the bear sign, but atmospheric conditions had deteriorated, causing significant static interference that prevented clear communication. The aurora borealis activity that had provided such spectacular displays during the pre-dawn hours was now creating electromagnetic interference that affected radio communications throughout the Churchill area. Harold's attempts to contact Thomas resulted only in broken transmissions that conveyed fragments of his growing concern, but failed to communicate the specific nature of the threat he faced. Thomas, listening from his home while battling influenza symptoms, detected only scattered words through the static and assumed Harold was reporting routine fishing updates rather than a life-threatening emergency situation. MB-47 had positioned himself behind a substantial pressure ridge, approximately 40 meters from Harold's fishing location, and was conducting what polar bear researchers term a patience hunt, remaining motionless while observing potential prey to determine the optimal moment for attack. Polar bears demonstrate remarkable patience during hunting situations, capable of remaining completely still for hours while waiting for seals to surface at breathing holes. The bear's black nose, the only dark feature visible against his cream-colored fur, moved constantly as he processed the complex array of scents emanating from Harold's fishing operation, analyzing the information to plan his approach strategy. The bear's physical condition reflected the severe nutritional stress caused by the extended period without successful hunting. His normally robust frame had become noticeably gaunt, with prominent hip bones and ribs visible beneath his thick fur coat. Adult male polar bears typically weigh between 600 and 800 pounds during peak condition, but MB-47's current weight had dropped to approximately 550 pounds, representing a loss of nearly 100 pounds during the past 2 months of unsuccessful hunting. This level of weight loss triggers increasingly desperate hunting behaviors, including aggressive pursuit of any potential food source, regardless of associated risks. At 9:35 in the morning, Harold's fourth tip-up flag activated simultaneously with a substantial fish striking his jigging rod, creating the dangerous situation of having his attention divided between 2 fishing rigs while a massive predator prepared to attack from concealment. Harold's excitement at the prospect of landing 2 fish simultaneously overrode his caution about the bear tracks he had discovered 15 minutes earlier. This moment of distraction, as Harold moved between his fishing holes while attempting to manage multiple hooked fish, provided MB-47 with the optimal opportunity to launch his attack. Polar bears can accelerate from a standing position to 35 miles per hour in under 6 seconds, covering ground with shocking speed that makes escape virtually impossible once an attack begins. MB-47's charge across the 40 meters of open ice separating him from Harold required approximately 8 seconds, during which Harold remained focused on his fishing rigs and completely unaware of the approaching danger. The bear's massive paws struck the ice with thunderous impacts that would have been clearly audible under normal circumstances, but the wind and Harold's concentration on his fishing equipment prevented him from detecting the sound of the approaching predator until the attack was already underway. Harold's first awareness of the bear's presence came when MB-47 was less than 10 meters away, moving at full speed directly toward him. The sight of the massive white predator charging across the ice triggered an immediate freeze response in Harold's nervous system, a psychological phenomenon that affects many humans when confronted with overwhelming danger. Instead of attempting to run or defend himself, Harold stood paralyzed for approximately 2 seconds, staring at the approaching bear while his mind struggled to process the reality of his situation. These 2 seconds of paralysis eliminated any possibility of reaching his truck or finding adequate shelter before the bear reached him. When Harold's paralysis broke, He attempted to run toward his truck, but the combination of bulky winter clothing, slippery ice conditions, and the bear's superior speed made escape impossible. Harold managed to cover approximately 15 feet before MB-47 caught him, striking him in the back with sufficient force to launch him 6 feet through the air before he crashed onto the ice surface. The impact of the bear's initial strike broke 2 of Harold's ribs and caused severe internal injuries, while the subsequent impact with the ice resulted in a concussion that left him dazed and disoriented during the crucial first moments of the attack. MB-47's attack followed the typical polar bear predation pattern documented in wildlife research literature, beginning with a powerful blow designed to stun and disable prey, followed by immediate attempts to inflict fatal bite wounds to the head and neck area. The bear's massive jaws, capable of exerting over 1,500 pounds of pressure per square inch, clamped down on Harold's head and upper torso, crushing his skull and severing major blood vessels in his neck within the first 30 seconds of the attack. Harold's thick winter clothing provided minimal protection against the bear's 4-inch canine teeth, which punctured through multiple layers of fabric and insulation to reach vital organs. The sounds of the attack carried clearly across the frozen landscape, a horrifying combination of Harold's screams, the bear's growling, and the sickening sounds of tearing fabric and flesh. These sounds reached the ears of 3 snowmobile riders who were traveling along the shore of Hudson Bay, approximately 2 kilometers south of Harold's fishing location. The snowmobile group consisted of Daniel Robert Sinclair, 28, a wildlife conservation officer with Manitoba Conservation and Water Stewardship, Marcus Anthony Johnson, 34, a freelance photographer from Thompson, Manitoba, and Jennifer Lynn Walsh, 26, a graduate student in Arctic ecology from the University of Saskatchewan. Daniel Sinclair had been patrolling the Churchill area as part of increased wildlife monitoring activities implemented following several polar bear sightings near populated areas during the previous week. His snowmobile, a 2023 Ski-Doo expedition equipped with emergency medical supplies and communication equipment, was capable of speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, 100 kilometers per hour across suitable terrain. Daniel's training as a wildlife conservation officer included specialized protocols for polar bear encounters, though his experience primarily involved preventive measures rather than active attack situations. His presence in the area represented one of the few factors that would prevent Harold's situation from being even more tragic than it ultimately became. Marcus Johnson had arrived in Churchill 3 days earlier to photograph winter wildlife for a magazine assignment documenting climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems. His professional-grade camera equipment, protected in waterproof cases mounted on his snowmobile, would capture some of the most disturbing images ever recorded of a polar bear attack on a human. Marcus stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, weighed 175 pounds, and possessed 10 years of experience photographing dangerous wildlife situations throughout Canada's Northern Territories. His documentation of the attack would later prove crucial for wildlife management decisions and legal proceedings related to the incident. Jennifer Walsh was conducting field research for her master's thesis on polar bear behavioral adaptations to changing ice conditions when she heard Harold's screams echoing across the frozen bay. Her research had taken her to Churchill for 6 weeks of winter observations, during which she had documented over 40 polar bear sightings and catalogued unusual behavioral patterns that supported her hypothesis about climate change impacts on predator behavior. Jennifer's academic knowledge of polar bear biology and behavior would prove invaluable during the rescue attempt, though nothing in her educational background had prepared her for witnessing the raw brutality of an actual predatory attack. The 3 snowmobile riders heard Harold's screams at 9:38 in the morning and immediately altered course toward the source of the sounds, reaching the attack site within 3 minutes of the initial assault. Their arrival occurred during the most brutal phase of the attack, as MB-47 had begun feeding on Harold while he was still alive but unconscious from massive blood loss and trauma. The sight that confronted the rescuers would haunt their memories for the remainder of their lives and require extensive psychological counseling to process the trauma of witnessing such extreme violence. Daniel Sinclair's training took over as he approached the attack site, drawing his service weapon, a Smith & Wesson Model 629.44 Magnum revolver loaded with special high-velocity ammunition designed for large, dangerous game. The weapon, carried specifically for polar bear encounters, fired 300-grain-jacketed soft-point bullets capable of penetrating the thick skull and muscle mass of adult polar bears. Daniel's marksmanship training included qualification courses specifically designed for shooting large bears under stress conditions, though he had never been required to use his weapon in an actual life-threatening situation involving human victims. The logistics of stopping a polar bear attack without endangering the human victim present enormous challenges that test even the most experienced wildlife officers. Daniel needed to approach close enough to ensure accurate shot placement while avoiding hitting Harold, who remained partially underneath the feeding bear. Polar bears possess remarkable resilience to gunshot wounds and can continue attacking even after sustaining multiple hits to non-vital areas, making precise shot placement absolutely critical for stopping an attack in progress. Daniel's first shot, fired from approximately 20 meters away, struck MB-47 in the shoulder, causing the bear to rear up and release his grip on Harold, but failing to incapacitate the animal. Marcus Johnson positioned himself approximately 50 meters from the attack site and began photographing the rescue attempt, capturing images that would later appear in news reports worldwide and spark international debate about polar bear management policies. His professional instincts compelled him to document the event despite the horrific nature of what he witnessed, creating a photographic record that would serve both journalistic and scientific purposes. The ethical implications of photographing human suffering would trouble Marcus for months afterward, though his documentation would prove invaluable for understanding the sequence of events and improving future emergency response protocols. Jennifer Walsh used her snowmobile radio to contact the Churchill RCMP detachment and Churchill Health Center to request immediate emergency medical assistance and additional wildlife officers. Her academic knowledge of polar bear behavior allowed her to provide critical information about the bear's likely responses to various intervention attempts, helping coordinate the rescue effort while providing detailed descriptions of the attack progression to emergency dispatchers. Jennifer's ability to remain calm and analytical despite witnessing extreme violence demonstrated the mental resilience that had enabled her to pursue research in one of the world's most challenging environments. Daniel's second shot struck MB-47 center mass, penetrating the bear's chest cavity and causing massive internal bleeding that began to slow the animal's movements. However, polar bears possess extraordinary vitality and can continue functioning for several minutes even after sustaining mortal wounds, requiring additional shots to ensure the bear could no longer pose a threat to rescuers attempting to provide medical assistance to Harold. The bear staggered backward approximately 10 meters from Harold's position, but remained upright and capable of renewed attack, forcing Daniel to fire a third shot that struck the animal in the head, finally ending the threat. The entire attack and rescue sequence lasted approximately 7 minutes from the time MB-47 initially struck Harold until Daniel's final shot ended the bear's life. During those 7 minutes, Harold suffered injuries so severe that survival seemed impossible, including massive blood loss from multiple bite wounds, crushing injuries to his skull and torso, and hypothermic shock from exposure to -34-degree temperatures, while his protective clothing was shredded by the bear's claws and teeth. Harold remained conscious intermittently during the latter stages of the attack, meaning he experienced the full horror of being consumed alive by the massive predator. Jennifer Walsh reached Harold's position first after Daniel confirmed the bear was dead, finding him lying motionless on blood-stained ice with injuries that defied comprehension. Harold's winter clothing had been completely destroyed, leaving him exposed to the deadly cold while bleeding profusely from wounds covering his head, neck, arms and torso. His breathing was shallow and irregular, indicating severe trauma to his respiratory system, while his pulse was barely detectable due to massive blood loss. Jennifer's field first aid training, supplemented by her research experience treating injured wildlife, enabled her to begin emergency treatment while waiting for professional medical assistance to arrive. The remote location of the attack, approximately 12 kilometers from Churchill's medical facilities, presented enormous logistical challenges for emergency medical response. The Churchill Health Centre, staffed by 2 physicians and 4 registered nurses, possessed limited trauma treatment capabilities and no helicopter evacuation services during winter months due to extreme weather conditions. The nearest major medical facility with advanced trauma capabilities was the Health Sciences Centre in Winnipeg, located over 1,000 kilometers south of Churchill and accessible only by commercial airlift services that might not be able to operate in current weather conditions. Dr. Michael David Restrepo, 45, the senior physician at Churchill Health Centre, received the emergency call at 9:46 in the morning while treating a patient with pneumonia symptoms. Dr. Restrepo, originally from Colombia, had completed his medical training at the University of Toronto before accepting his current position in Churchill to gain experience in remote northern medicine. His 7 years of practice in Churchill had exposed him to various trauma cases, including several bear attacks, but none as severe as what he would encounter when Harold arrived at the health centre. Dr. Restrepo immediately began preparing the facility's limited trauma resources while coordinating with medical evacuation services in Winnipeg. Nurse Patricia Ann Morrison, 52, the health centre's most experienced trauma nurse, began assembling blood transfusion supplies and advanced life support equipment while Dr. Restrepo attempted to arrange helicopter evacuation for Harold. Patricia had worked in northern Manitoba healthcare for 28 years, including 12 years in Churchill, and possessed extensive experience treating severe trauma cases resulting from industrial accidents, wildlife encounters, and extreme weather exposure. Her expertise in managing medical emergencies with limited resources would prove crucial in maintaining Harold's vital signs during the critical first hours after the attack. The logistics of transporting Harold from the attack site to the health centre required coordination between multiple emergency response agencies operating under extreme weather conditions. The Churchill Fire Department dispatched their tracked emergency vehicle, a specialized all-terrain medical transport designed for Arctic conditions, along with emergency medical technician Robert James Kowalski, 39, and emergency medical technician Sarah Elizabeth Chen, 27. Both EMTs possessed advanced wilderness first aid certifications and experience treating hypothermia and trauma cases, though neither had previously encountered injuries as severe as those inflicted by a polar bear attack. The 14-minute transport from the attack site to the health centre presented continuous challenges in maintaining Harold's vital signs while preventing further hypothermic injury. Harold's body temperature had dropped to approximately 32 degrees Celsius, approaching the threshold for fatal hypothermia, while his blood pressure remained dangerously low due to massive blood loss from multiple wounds. EMT Kowalski established intravenous access and began fluid resuscitation, while EMT Chen managed airway protection and assisted ventilation using a bag mask ventilation system. The combination of Harold's injuries and the transport conditions made advanced life support extremely difficult to maintain during the journey to medical care. Harold arrived at Churchill Health Centre at 10:18 in the morning in critical condition with multiple life-threatening injuries that exceeded the facility's treatment capabilities. Dr. Restrepo's initial assessment revealed devastating trauma, including a fractured skull with probable brain injury, multiple lacerations to the scalp and face requiring surgical repair, puncture wounds to the chest and abdomen with possible internal organ damage, compound fractures of the left arm and several ribs, and severe hypothermia requiring immediate warming protocols. The extent of Harold's injuries made it clear that survival would require immediate evacuation to a major trauma center equipped with neurosurgical and thoracic surgical capabilities. Weather conditions prevented helicopter evacuation, forcing Dr. Restrepo to arrange ground transportation to Thompson, Manitoba, where Harold could board a medical evacuation flight to Winnipeg. The 300-kilometer journey to Thompson would require approximately 4 hours under current road conditions, during which Harold's condition would need to be maintained using portable life support equipment with limited capabilities. Dr. Restrepo made the difficult decision to accompany Harold during the ground transport, leaving the health center temporarily understaffed, but ensuring that Harold received the highest possible level of medical care during the critical transport period. The medical evacuation vehicle, operated by Northern Manitoba Medical Transport Services, arrived in Churchill at 11:45 in the morning equipped with advanced life support capabilities, including mechanical ventilation, blood transfusion equipment, and cardiac monitoring systems. The vehicle's crew consisted of critical care paramedic Linda Marie Johansson, 41, a 15-year veteran of Northern Medical Transport Operations, and critical care paramedic David Anthony Rodriguez, 36, who specialized in trauma cases and hypothermia treatment. Both paramedics possessed extensive experience in long-distance medical transports under extreme weather conditions, though Harold's case represented one of the most severe trauma situations either had encountered. News of the polar bear attack spread rapidly through Churchill's close-knit community of approximately 900 residents, creating waves of shock and concern that rippled through the town within hours of the incident. Word of Harold's attack reached his wife Margaret through a phone call from Eleanor Mackenzie, Thomas's wife, who had learned of the incident through emergency service communications monitoring. Margaret's reaction to the news of her husband's attack demonstrated the devastating impact that wildlife encounters have on family members who must cope with both immediate medical crises and long-term uncertainty about their loved ones' survival and recovery prospects. Margaret Peters arrived at Churchill Health Centre at 10:55 in the morning, accompanied by her daughter Amanda Louise Peterson, 32, who had driven immediately from her home in Thompson upon learning of her father's attack. Amanda, a registered nurse working at Thompson General Hospital, possessed medical knowledge that helped her understand the severity of her father's injuries, while simultaneously making the emotional impact of his condition more devastating. The sight of Harold's injuries, combined with the uncertainty surrounding his survival prospects, created a psychological trauma for family members that would require extensive counseling and support services. The polar bear attack also had immediate implications for Churchill's tourism industry and wildlife management policies, as news of the incident spread through social media and traditional news outlets within hours of occurrence. Churchill's economy depends heavily on polar bear tourism, bringing thousands of visitors annually to observe and photograph the bears during their fall migration period. Serious polar bear attacks on local residents create negative publicity that can impact tourism revenue, while raising questions about the effectiveness of current wildlife management strategies designed to minimize human-bear conflicts. Dr. Thornfield learned of the attack involving MB-47 at 11:30 in the morning through radio communications between conservation officers coordinating the response to Harold's injuries. The news that one of her research subjects had killed a human being created professional and ethical dilemmas regarding her ongoing research activities and the responsibility of wildlife researchers to warn communities about potentially dangerous animal behavior. Dr. Thornfield's tracking data showed that MB-47 had been exhibiting increasingly desperate hunting behaviors for several weeks. Information that might have prevented Harold's attack if it had been more widely disseminated to local residents engaged in outdoor activities. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding Harold's attack began immediately, involving multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and responsibilities for wildlife management, public safety, and criminal investigation procedures. Royal Canadian Mounted Police Constable Jennifer Marie Blackhawk, 31, arrived at the attack site at 11:15 in the morning to begin documenting the scene and collecting evidence that would be required for official incident reports and potential legal proceedings. Constable Blackhawk, a member of the Norway House Cree Nation who had transferred to Churchill from the RCMP detachment in the Pas 18 months earlier, possessed specialized training in wilderness crime scene investigation and wildlife incident documentation. The attack scene presented a horrific tableau that challenged even experienced investigators accustomed to violent crime scenes. Blood covered approximately 30 square meters of ice surface, creating dark stains that contrasted starkly against the white snow and ice. Harold's destroyed fishing equipment lay scattered across the area, with his expensive rods and reels damaged beyond repair by the bear's attack. MB-47's carcass, weighing an estimated 550 pounds, lay approximately 10 meters from the main attack site, with bullet wounds clearly visible in the shoulder, chest, and head areas. The scene documentation required several hours of photography and measurement to create an accurate record of events for official reports and potential legal proceedings. Manitoba Conservation and Water Stewardship initiated their own investigation into the attack, focusing on factors that might have contributed to the bear's aggressive behavior and potential policy changes needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Senior wildlife biologist Dr. Richard Thomas Anderson, 57, arrived in Churchill at 2:30 in the afternoon to begin examining MB-47's carcass and analyzing environmental factors that might have influenced the bear's decision to attack a human. Dr. Anderson's 32 years of experience studying polar bear behavior in Manitoba included investigation of 7 previous fatal attacks, providing him with expertise crucial for understanding the circumstances that led to Harold's tragic encounter. The autopsy of MB-47, conducted at the Churchill Research Facility, revealed the extent of nutritional stress that had driven the bear to attack Harold. The bear's stomach contained no food remnants, indicating he had not eaten successfully in at least 2 weeks, while body fat measurements showed he had lost approximately 20% of his normal body weight during the previous 2 months. These findings supported Dr. Thornfield's research data, suggesting that climate change impacts on sea ice formation were creating increasingly desperate conditions for polar bears during their traditional hunting seasons. Medical updates on Harold's condition during transport to Thompson and subsequent evacuation to Winnipeg painted a grim picture of his survival prospects, despite heroic efforts by medical teams throughout the treatment chain. Harold remained unconscious throughout the transport, sustained by mechanical ventilation and continuous blood transfusions that barely maintained his vital signs. His body temperature gradually increased during transport, though severe hypothermia had caused additional complications, including cardiac arrhythmias and kidney dysfunction that further threatened his survival prospects. The arrival at Thompson General Hospital at 3:45 in the afternoon marked a critical transition point in Harold's medical care, as the facility's enhanced capabilities allowed more aggressive treatment of his multiple injuries. Emergency physician Dr. Susan Marie Patel, 42, led the trauma team that assumed Harold's care upon arrival, immediately recognizing that his injuries required capabilities beyond what Thompson could provide despite their best efforts. Dr. Patel's assessment confirmed Dr. Restrepo's earlier evaluation that Harold required immediate neurosurgical intervention that could only be provided at a major trauma center, necessitating continued evacuation to Winnipeg despite his critical condition. Weather conditions had improved sufficiently by 4:15 in the afternoon to allow helicopter evacuation from Thompson to Winnipeg, though the flight would push the limits of both weather minimums and Harold's medical stability. The helicopter crew, operated by Life Flight Air Ambulance Services, consisted of pilot Captain Michael Robert Stevens, 47, flight nurse Jennifer Lynn Campbell, 38, and critical care paramedic Thomas Edward Murphy, 44. The crew possessed extensive experience in high-risk medical evacuations under extreme weather conditions, though Harold's case represented one of the most challenging combinations of severe injuries and marginal weather conditions they had encountered. The 90-minute flight from Thompson to Winnipeg required constant medical intervention to maintain Harold's vital signs while managing complications arising from changes in altitude and atmospheric pressure. Harold suffered cardiac arrest twice during the flight, requiring aggressive resuscitation efforts that further complicated his already precarious medical condition. Flight nurse Campbell's expertise in high-altitude emergency medicine proved crucial in maintaining Harold's survival during these critical episodes, though each cardiac arrest reduced his already minimal chances of meaningful recovery. Harold arrived at Health Sciences Centre Winnipeg at 6:30 in the afternoon, where the trauma team led by Dr. Patricia Ann Richardson, 51, one of Canada's most experienced trauma surgeons, immediately took him to the operating room for emergency surgery to address his most life-threatening injuries. The surgical team faced the daunting challenge of repairing massive cranial injuries while simultaneously addressing internal bleeding from multiple organs damaged during the bear attack. Dr. Richardson's initial assessment indicated that even if Harold survived the immediate surgical interventions, the extent of his neurological injuries made meaningful recovery extremely unlikely. The first surgical procedure, lasting 4 hours and 27 minutes, focused on controlling intracranial bleeding and removing bone fragments from Harold's brain tissue while simultaneously repairing the massive skull fractures that had resulted from MB-47's crushing bite. Neurosurgeon Dr. James Alexander Morrison, 43, worked in conjunction with Dr. Richardson to address the complex combination of traumatic brain injury and multiple organ trauma that threatened Harold's survival from several different directions simultaneously. The surgical team discovered that the bear's teeth had penetrated Harold's skull in 3 separate locations, causing widespread brain tissue damage that extended far beyond the visible external wounds. Concurrent with the neurosurgical procedures, thoracic surgeon Dr. Maria Elena Vasquez, 39, addressed the severe chest injuries that had resulted from the bear's claws and teeth penetrating Harold's torso. The bear's attack had caused multiple rib fractures, pneumothorax in both lungs, and lacerations to the liver and spleen that required immediate surgical repair to prevent fatal internal bleeding. Dr. Vasquez's examination revealed that Harold's protective winter clothing had been completely ineffective against the bear's 4-inch canine teeth, which had penetrated through multiple layers of insulation and fabric as easily as if they had been tissue paper. The complexity of Harold's injuries required a multidisciplinary surgical approach involving specialists from neurosurgery, thoracic surgery, orthopedic surgery, and plastic surgery working simultaneously to address the multiple life-threatening conditions resulting from the bear attack. Orthopedic surgeon Dr. Robert Kenneth Walsh, 55, repaired the compound fractures of Harold's left arm and multiple rib fractures, while plastic surgeon Dr. Amanda Marie Chen, 37, began the extensive reconstructive work necessary to repair the massive facial and scalp lacerations that had destroyed much of Harold's recognizable features. The coordination required between multiple surgical teams working on different aspects of Harold's injuries represented one of the most complex trauma cases in the hospital's recent history. Throughout the surgical procedures, Harold's vital signs remained critically unstable, requiring continuous support from anesthesiologist Dr. David Michael Thompson, 46, who managed the delicate balance between maintaining adequate anesthesia for major surgery while supporting cardiovascular function in a patient with massive blood loss and hypothermic injury. Harold's blood pressure fluctuated dangerously throughout the procedure, requiring multiple blood transfusions and vasopressor medications to maintain adequate circulation to vital organs. The anesthesia team administered over 20 units of blood products during the initial surgical intervention, representing nearly twice Harold's total blood volume. Margaret Peters and her daughter Amanda maintained a vigil in the surgical waiting area throughout Harold's lengthy operation, receiving periodic updates from surgical staff that painted an increasingly grim picture of his survival prospects. The family liaison nurse, Catherine Louise Anderson, 51, provided emotional support and medical interpretation services to help Harold's family understand the complex medical decisions being made regarding his care. The psychological impact on family members of witnessing their loved one's catastrophic injuries, combined with the uncertainty surrounding his survival and potential recovery, created secondary trauma that would require extensive mental health support services. Dr. Richardson emerged from the operating room at 11:15 in the evening to inform Harold's family that the surgical procedures had been technically successful in controlling immediate life-threatening bleeding and stabilizing his most critical injuries, though his long-term prognosis remained extremely guarded. The surgeon explained that Harold had suffered what medical professionals term a survivable-unsurvivable injury pattern, meaning that while modern trauma surgery could maintain his vital functions in the short term, the extent of his neurological damage made meaningful recovery virtually impossible. The family faced the devastating reality that even if Harold survived his injuries, he would likely remain in a persistent vegetative state, requiring permanent institutional care. The news media response to Harold's attack began within hours of the incident, as word of the polar bear attack spread through social media networks and attracted attention from news organizations across Canada and internationally. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation reporter Jessica Marie Kowalski, 29, arrived in Churchill at 7:30 in the evening to begin coverage of the attack and its implications for polar bear management policies in the region. Jessica's reporting would bring international attention to the incident while raising questions about climate change, impacts on polar bear behavior, and the adequacy of current wildlife management strategies to protect both humans and bears. The Churchill community's response to Harold's attack demonstrated the tight-knit nature of northern communities, where residents depend on each other for survival in harsh environments, and wildlife attacks affect everyone emotionally and psychologically. Local businesses closed early on January 8th to allow employees to gather information about Harold's condition and offer support to Margaret and her family during the medical crisis. The Churchill Community Centre opened its doors as an informal gathering place where residents could share information, express their concerns about wildlife safety, and organise support efforts for Harold's family. Thomas Mackenzie's guilt over his decision not to accompany Harold on the fishing expedition intensified throughout the day as details of the attack became known throughout the community. Thomas's wife Eleanor found him sitting in their kitchen at midnight, staring at his unused fishing equipment while struggling with the knowledge that his presence might have altered the outcome of Harold's encounter with MB-47. The psychological impact of survivors' guilt on individuals who escape tragedy through chance circumstances represents a common but often overlooked consequence of wildlife attacks that affects entire communities rather than just direct victims and their families. The investigation into factors contributing to Harold's attack continued throughout the night, as conservation officers, RCMP investigators, and wildlife biologists worked to piece together the sequence of events that led to the tragic encounter. Daniel Sinclair's detailed report of the rescue operation provided crucial information about the bear's behavior during and after the attack, while Marcus Johnson's photographic documentation offered visual evidence of the incident's progression and the rescue team's response. The investigation aimed to identify any policy changes or preventive measures that might reduce the likelihood of similar attacks in the future. Dr. Thornfield's analysis of MB-47's tracking data revealed disturbing patterns that suggested the bear's attack on Harold might not have been an isolated incident of opportunistic predation, but rather part of increasingly desperate hunting behaviors driven by extended periods without successful feeding. The satellite collar data showed that MB-47 had been approaching human activity areas with increasing frequency during the past month, indicating a dangerous escalation in risk-taking behavior that wildlife managers had not recognized before the attack occurred. This information raised serious questions about the effectiveness of current monitoring systems for identifying potentially dangerous bears before they threaten human safety. The broader implications of Harold's attack extended beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass ongoing debates about climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems and the sustainability of human activities in polar bear habitat. Environmental scientists had predicted that warming temperatures and delayed sea ice formation would create increasingly desperate conditions for polar bears, leading to more frequent conflicts with humans as bears sought alternative food sources during extended ice-free periods. Harold's attack provided tragic confirmation of these predictions, while highlighting the inadequacy of current management strategies to address the changing dynamics of human-bear interactions in a warming Arctic environment. Media coverage of the attack intensified throughout the following days as news organizations recognized the story's significance as both human tragedy and environmental cautionary tale. Television news crews from major Canadian networks arrived in Churchill to document the community's response to the attack, while interviewing residents about their experiences living in proximity to one of the world's most dangerous predators. The coverage brought unwanted attention to Churchill's normally quiet winter months, while raising concerns about the impact of negative publicity on the community's tourism-dependent economy. Harold's condition remained critical but stable throughout his second day in the intensive care unit, though neurological assessments conducted by Dr. Morrison revealed extensive brain damage that confirmed the surgical team's initial prognosis regarding his recovery prospects. Advanced imaging studies showed widespread cerebral edema and multiple areas of brain tissue death resulting from both direct trauma and secondary injury caused by bleeding and oxygen deprivation during the attack and transport. The neurological damage extended throughout multiple brain regions responsible for consciousness, motor function, and cognitive abilities, making meaningful recovery virtually impossible even with the most aggressive rehabilitation efforts. Margaret Peters faced the agonizing decision of whether to continue aggressive medical treatment for her husband or transition to comfort care, measures that would allow him to die peacefully surrounded by family members. The medical team explained that Harold's neurological injuries were incompatible with conscious existence, though mechanical life support could potentially maintain his vital functions indefinitely. The ethical and emotional complexity of end-of-life decisions following traumatic injuries created additional psychological trauma for family members already struggling to cope with the sudden transformation of their lives from normalcy to tragedy. The autopsy results from MB-47's examination provided scientific confirmation of the factors that had driven the bear to attack Harold, revealing severe malnutrition and physiological stress indicators that explained the animal's desperate hunting behavior. Dr. Anderson's analysis showed that the bear's body fat reserves had been depleted to levels that would normally trigger hibernation or death in less hardy species, while his stomach contents confirmed that he had not successfully hunted in several weeks. These findings supported the hypothesis that climate change impacts on sea ice formation were creating conditions that forced polar bears into increasingly dangerous interactions with humans as they sought alternative food sources. The investigation into the attack also revealed several policy and procedural failures that might have prevented Harold's tragic encounter with MB-47. Dr. Thornfield's research data showing the bear's increasingly desperate behavior had not been effectively communicated to local residents or wildlife management authorities, representing a breakdown in the information sharing systems designed to protect both humans and wildlife. Additionally, the early warning systems designed to alert residents about dangerous bears in their area had failed to identify MB-47 as an immediate threat, despite his proximity to popular fishing locations and his documented pattern of approaching human activity areas. Conservation authorities announced new protocols for monitoring polar bear movements and communicating threat information to local residents engaged in outdoor activities, though critics argued that these measures represented inadequate responses to the fundamental problem of climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems. The new protocols included enhanced satellite tracking of bears, showing unusual behavior patterns, improved communication systems for sharing threat information with local residents, and stricter guidelines for outdoor activities during periods of high polar bear activity. However, these measures failed to address the underlying environmental changes that were driving increasingly desperate bear behavior throughout the Hudson Bay region. The legal implications of Harold's attack began to emerge as family members consulted with attorneys regarding potential liability issues related to wildlife management policies and emergency response procedures. While polar bear attacks are generally considered unavoidable natural disasters rather than situations involving legal liability, Harold's family questioned whether governmental agencies had fulfilled their responsibilities to protect public safety, given the available information about MB-47's dangerous behavior patterns. The complex legal questions surrounding wildlife management responsibilities and government liability for wildlife attacks would require extensive litigation to resolve. Harold's fishing partner, Thomas Mackenzie, struggled with increasing psychological trauma as details of the attack became widely known throughout the Churchill community, experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder despite not having witnessed the incident directly. Thomas's survivor's guilt was compounded by well-meaning community members who repeatedly mentioned how fortunate he was to have avoided Harold's fate, inadvertently reinforcing his feelings of responsibility for not accompanying his friend on the fatal fishing expedition. The psychological impact on community members indirectly affected by wildlife attacks represents an often overlooked consequence that can persist for years after the initial incident. The economic impact of Harold's attack on Churchill's tourism industry became apparent as several tour operators reported cancellations and inquiries from potential visitors concerned about polar bear safety. Churchill's economy depends heavily on polar bear tourism during the fall migration season, generating millions of dollars annually for local businesses and supporting hundreds of jobs in a community with limited economic alternatives. Negative publicity surrounding fatal polar bear attacks can significantly impact tourism revenue while raising questions about the long-term viability of wildlife tourism in areas with large populations of dangerous predators. Medical updates on Harold's condition during his third day in intensive care showed no improvement in neurological function despite optimal medical management of his other injuries, confirming the surgical team's initial assessment that meaningful recovery was impossible. Advanced monitoring systems showed minimal brain activity consistent with severe global brain injury, while Harold remained completely dependent on mechanical ventilation and multiple life support systems to maintain basic physiological functions. The absence of any purposeful neurological responses or signs of consciousness indicated that Harold's brain injuries had been catastrophic and irreversible. Margaret Peters made the difficult decision to discontinue aggressive medical treatment and allow Harold to die naturally after consulting with medical ethicists, family members, and spiritual advisors about the appropriate course of action. The decision reflected Margaret's belief that Harold would not have wanted to continue existing in a vegetative state without hope of meaningful recovery, though the emotional weight of making end-of-life decisions for a spouse created lasting psychological trauma. The transition from aggressive treatment to comfort care measures allowed family members to say goodbye, while Harold was gradually weaned from life support systems. Harold Benjamin Peters died at 2:37 in the afternoon on January 11, 2025, 3 days after his encounter with MB-47 on the frozen waters of Hudson Bay near Churchill, Manitoba. His death certificate listed the cause of death as multiple traumatic injuries sustained in a polar bear attack, making him the 8th person killed by polar bears in Manitoba since comprehensive record-keeping began in 1968. Harold's death represented not only a personal tragedy for his family and community, but also a harbinger of the increasing frequency of human-wildlife conflicts expected as climate change continues to disrupt traditional patterns of wildlife behavior throughout the Arctic. The funeral arrangements for Harold reflected both the close-knit nature of the Churchill community and the broader significance of his death as a symbol of the challenges facing northern communities in an era of environmental change. Margaret Peters chose to hold the funeral service at Churchill's United Church, where Harold had been a regular attendee since moving to the community 3 years earlier. The service was attended by over 300 people, including residents from throughout northern Manitoba, who traveled to Churchill to pay their respects to Harold and show support for his family during their grief. Reverend Michael James Patterson, 62, who had known Harold since his arrival in Churchill, delivered a eulogy that honored Harold's life while acknowledging the tragic circumstances of his death and the broader environmental challenges facing Arctic communities. Reverend Patterson, who had conducted funeral services for 2 previous polar bear attack victims during his 15 years in Churchill, struggled to find words that could provide comfort to Harold's family while addressing the community's collective trauma and fears about living in proximity to increasingly desperate wildlife populations. The media coverage of Harold's funeral brought additional attention to the story, while highlighting the human cost of climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems, though some community members resented the intrusion of outside media during their time of grief. Television crews from several major news networks documented the funeral proceedings while interviewing residents about their experiences living with polar bear threats and their concerns about increasing wildlife conflicts. The coverage served to personalize the broader environmental crisis while demonstrating the resilience of northern communities facing unprecedented challenges. Dr. Thornfield's research activities faced scrutiny following Harold's death, as wildlife management authorities questioned whether her tracking data could have been used to prevent the attack if different protocols had been in place for sharing threat information with local residents. The incident highlighted fundamental tensions between wildlife research objectives and public safety responsibilities, particularly regarding how scientific data about dangerous animal behavior should be communicated to communities at risk. Dr. Thornfield's experience became a case study in the ethical responsibilities of wildlife researchers working with potentially dangerous species in areas with human populations. The investigation into Harold's attack concluded 6 weeks after his death, with the release of a comprehensive report detailing the sequence of events and recommending policy changes to reduce the likelihood of similar incidents in the future. The report identified several contributing factors, including MB47's severe nutritional stress, inadequate communication of threat information to local residents, and the absence of effective early warning systems for identifying dangerous bears before they pose immediate threats to human safety. The recommendations included enhanced monitoring systems, improved information sharing protocols, and stricter guidelines for outdoor activities during periods of high polar bear activity. Margaret Peters established the Harold Peters Memorial Fund to support polar bear research and wildlife safety education programs, channeling her grief into efforts to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The fund supported research into polar bear behavior and climate change impacts, while financing safety education programs for residents of northern communities living in polar bear habitat. Margaret's advocacy work brought her into contact with other families affected by wildlife attacks, creating a support network for individuals struggling with trauma and loss resulting from human-wildlife conflicts. The long-term psychological impact of Harold's attack extended throughout the Churchill community, with many residents reporting symptoms of anxiety and hypervigilance when engaging in outdoor activities that had previously been considered routine and safe. The community mental health resources, already limited in the remote northern location, proved inadequate to address the collective trauma experienced by residents who suddenly felt vulnerable to predation in their own environment. The psychological aftermath of Harold's attack demonstrated that wildlife incidents affect entire communities rather than just direct victims and their immediate families. Thomas Mackenzie required professional counseling to address his survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress symptoms, eventually relocating to Winnipeg, where he could access more comprehensive mental health services while escaping the constant reminders of Harold's death that pervaded daily life in Churchill. Thomas's experience illustrated how wildlife attacks can force community members to abandon their homes and lifestyles, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate tragedy. His departure from Churchill represented one of several instances of outmigration following Harold's attack, as some residents decided they could no longer live comfortably in an environment they now perceived as threatening. The policy changes implemented following Harold's attack included enhanced satellite monitoring of polar bears, showing unusual behavior patterns, though the effectiveness of these measures remained questionable given the fundamental environmental changes driving increasingly desperate bear behavior. Wildlife management authorities increased patrols in areas frequented by local residents while implementing improved communication systems for sharing threat information. But critics argued that these measures address symptoms rather than the underlying cause of increasing human-bear conflicts. The challenge of protecting both human safety and polar bear populations in an era of rapid environmental change required solutions that extended far beyond traditional wildlife management approaches. 1 year after Harold's death, Margaret Peters participated in a documentary film examining the impact of climate change on Arctic communities and wildlife populations, sharing her story as part of a broader narrative about the human cost of environmental degradation. The documentary, titled When Ice Fails, featured Margaret's account of Harold's attack alongside scientific analysis of climate change, impacts on polar bear behavior, and predictions for future human-wildlife conflicts in the Arctic. Margaret's participation in the film represented her ongoing efforts to ensure that Harold's death contributed to greater awareness of environmental challenges facing northern communities. The anniversary of Harold's attack was marked by a memorial service at the attack site, where community members gathered to remember Harold while reflecting on the changes that had occurred in their lives and community during the year since his death. The memorial included the placement of a stone cairn marking the location where Harold had died, creating a permanent reminder of the tragedy while serving as a symbol of the community's resilience in the face of unprecedented environmental challenges. The ceremony was attended by Harold's family, friends, and community members, as well as researchers and wildlife management officials who continued to study the incident's implications for future policy development. Dr. Anderson's long-term analysis of Harold's attack and its contributing factors became a cornerstone study in the field of human-wildlife conflict research, providing insights into the complex interactions between climate change, wildlife behavior, and human safety that would inform management strategies throughout the Arctic. The research demonstrated that traditional approaches to wildlife management developed during periods of relatively stable environmental conditions were inadequate for addressing the rapidly changing dynamics of human-wildlife interactions in a warming climate. The findings supported arguments for fundamental changes in how northern communities approach coexistence with large predators in an era of environmental uncertainty. The legal proceedings related to Harold's attack concluded 18 months after his death, with settlements that acknowledged governmental responsibility for inadequate communication of wildlife threat information, while establishing precedents for future cases involving wildlife management liability. The settlements provided financial support for Margaret Peters while funding enhanced wildlife monitoring and communication systems designed to prevent similar tragedies. The legal resolution created frameworks for addressing similar cases in the future while establishing governmental obligations to protect public safety through effective wildlife threat communication systems. Margaret Peters eventually relocated to Thompson, Manitoba, where she could be closer to her daughter Amanda, while escaping the daily reminders of Harold's death that made continued residence in Churchill emotionally unbearable. Her departure represented the loss of another long-term community member, contributing to Churchill's ongoing challenges with population retention as residents struggled to adapt to increasing wildlife threats and environmental changes. Margaret's relocation illustrated how wildlife attacks create cascading effects that extend far beyond immediate victims to reshape entire communities over extended periods. The Churchill community's recovery from Harold's attack required several years of collective healing and adaptation to new realities regarding wildlife safety and environmental change, with some residents eventually moving away while others developed new approaches to coexisting with polar bear populations. The incident fundamentally altered how residents approached outdoor activities, with many adopting enhanced safety protocols or abandoning previously routine activities they now considered too dangerous. The community's experience became a model for other northern settlements facing similar challenges as climate change continued to disrupt traditional patterns of human-wildlife interaction throughout the Arctic. 5 years after Harold's death, the Harold Peters Memorial Fund had supported numerous research projects and safety education programs throughout northern Canada, creating a lasting legacy that honored Harold's memory while contributing to efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The fund's activities included supporting Dr. Thornfield's continued research into polar bear behavior, financing safety education programs for northern communities, and advocating for policy changes to address climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems. Margaret Peters' transformation from grieving widow to wildlife safety advocate demonstrated how personal tragedy could be channeled into efforts to protect others from similar experiences. The technological advances in wildlife monitoring that emerged partially in response to Harold's attack included sophisticated early warning systems capable of tracking individual bears and predicting their likelihood of approaching human settlements. Though the effectiveness of these systems remained limited by the fundamental environmental changes driving increasingly desperate wildlife behavior. The new monitoring systems provided better information about bear movements and behavior patterns, but could not address the underlying cause of increasing human-bear conflicts represented by climate change impacts on traditional hunting opportunities for polar bears. Educational programs developed in Harold's memory reached thousands of residents throughout northern Canada, providing training in wildlife safety, emergency response, and environmental awareness that helped communities better prepare for coexistence with large predators in changing environmental conditions. The programs emphasized practical safety measures while building understanding of the environmental factors driving changes in wildlife behavior, creating more informed and prepared communities capable of responding effectively to wildlife threats. The education initiatives represented Harold's most lasting legacy, contributing to improved safety outcomes for countless individuals living in polar bear habitat. The scientific understanding of polar bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions advanced significantly following Harold's attack, as researchers used the incident as a case study for understanding the complex factors that contribute to predatory attacks on humans by large carnivores. The research findings influenced wildlife management policies throughout the Arctic, while contributing to international discussions about conservation strategies for polar bears facing habitat loss due to climate change. Harold's death, while tragic, provided insights that helped protect both human communities and polar bear populations facing unprecedented environmental challenges. Margaret Peters died peacefully in her sleep at Thompson General Hospital on March 15, 2031, 6 years and 2 months after Harold's attack, having spent her final years advocating for wildlife safety and climate change awareness, while honoring her husband's memory through educational and research initiatives. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout northern Canada who had been touched by her advocacy work and inspired by her ability to transform personal tragedy into efforts to protect others. Margaret's death marked the end of an era for the Harold Peters Memorial Fund, though the organization continued its work under new leadership committed to carrying forward her vision. The long-term impact of Harold Peters' death on January 8, 2025, extended far beyond the immediate tragedy to influence wildlife management policies, community safety practices, and scientific understanding of human-wildlife interactions throughout the Arctic regions of North America, creating a lasting legacy that honored his memory while contributing to the safety and well-being of countless individuals living in proximity to large predators. The incident served as a catalyst for fundamental changes in how northern communities approach coexistence with dangerous wildlife in an era of rapid environmental change, demonstrating how individual tragedies can contribute to broader societal adaptations that benefit future generations. Harold's story became required reading in wildlife management programs throughout North America, serving as a case study in the complex interactions between climate change, wildlife behavior, and human safety that define the challenges facing Arctic communities in the 21st century. The detailed documentation of his attack, rescue, medical treatment, and aftermath provided unprecedented insights into all aspects of human-wildlife conflict, from the initial encounter through long-term community recovery processes. His experience illuminated the personal and social costs of environmental change while highlighting the resilience of northern communities facing unprecedented challenges. The polar bear that killed Harold Peters, designated as MB47 in research databases, became a symbol of the broader environmental crisis affecting Arctic ecosystems, representing the desperate struggle for survival faced by wildlife populations as climate change destroys their traditional habitats and hunting opportunities. The bear's severe malnutrition and desperate hunting behavior demonstrated the cascading effects of environmental change on individual animals, species populations, and human communities sharing Arctic landscapes. The incident provided concrete evidence of climate change impacts that extended far beyond abstract scientific projections to encompass the lived experiences of real people and animals struggling to survive in rapidly changing environments. The location where Harold died, now marked by a permanent memorial cairn, serves as a reminder of the ongoing challenges facing northern communities as they adapt to new realities regarding wildlife safety and environmental change in an era of unprecedented global transformation. Visitors to the memorial site reflect on the complex relationships between humans and wildlife, while contemplating the broader environmental changes that continue to reshape Arctic landscapes and ecosystems. The memorial represents both personal loss and collective acknowledgement of the need for fundamental changes in how human societies relate to the natural world. Harold Benjamin Peters' life and death embodied the experiences of countless individuals living on the front lines of climate change, whose daily existence brings them into increasingly dangerous contact with wildlife populations struggling to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions throughout the world's polar regions. His story serves as both tragedy and warning, illustrating the human cost of environmental degradation while demonstrating the courage and resilience of communities facing unprecedented challenges with dignity and determination. The legacy of January 8, 2025, continues to influence wildlife management, community safety, and environmental policy throughout the Arctic, ensuring that Harold's death contributed to greater understanding and protection for both human communities and wildlife populations facing an uncertain future in a rapidly changing world.